Hey there. Tonight, buffalo hide cover, ozan inner lining, smoke flap, and stones that keep a quiet, stored warmth. How did sub-zero wind become a draft that fed the fire? And why did heat belong to the whole lodge, made each night by hands and habit? Before you get too cozy, if this kind of quiet storytelling helps you drift off, you can tap like and subscribe without lifting your head from the pillow. While you're there, tell me the city you're listening from and what time it is. I'm always curious how late you're keeping me company. Now dim the lights. Let a small fan add that gentle hum. Soften your breathing, and let's slip into tonight's journey together. Drift with me. The coals are slow, the airflow sure. And the winter door is laced. Let's begin. The night is a low bell, humming over snow that has turned the prairie silver and speechless. Outside, the wind combs the grass stubble, finds the seams of everything made by human hands, and tests them. Inside the lodge, a woman kneels at the threshold, where the winter door thick, hide-laced, edge to edge, breathes a little at the stitching. She presses her palm to the lashings, as if checking a child's brow. The air answers, not a leak, only a whisper, and the whisper is good. In winter, warmth begins with listening. You feel it as you enter, not in the shock of heat, not a stove's arrogant blast, but a shawl of temperature. The floor is layered with willow mats and hides. The ground has surrendered its sting to thick, oiled leather that smells faintly of smoke and animal fat. The fire in the shallow hearth is small on purpose, a steady pupil of orange, its edges feathered with blue. Big fires are for crowds and ceremony. Night fires, the ones that outlast Thaw, are little engineered. They throw heat quietly, feed convection in a way that keeps the smoke thin and obedient, and put more work into warming stone than into entertaining eye. Someone turns a heated stone with a forked stick slowly, respectfully. Stones are the lodge's batteries. They remember the day's flame and give it back inch by inch as the hours do what hours do. In a little while, the stone will be wrapped in a pouch of hide and eased near an elder's knees or into the foot of a child's bedding. Through the hide, the warmth comes like a friend at the door, never barging in, only arriving and staying. If you were to stand where the firekeeper stands and raise your hand to shoulder height, you would feel the current of air that makes the system honest. Cold air is invited, not excluded. It slides in low, under the lining, the ozan, where the space between the outer cover and the inner drop creates a quiet hallway for drafts. The draft is not an enemy, but a servant. It feeds the fire, gives smoke direction, and keeps breath safe. The lining takes the sharpness off the incoming air, and by the time it reaches the ember's lip, it is a useful thing. Above, the smoke flaps 2 ears of hide at the apex. Listen to the wind, like dancers reading a drum. A small turn of a pole, a small change of angle, and the path open. Smoke chooses sky over lungs. Near the door, gloves hang like sleeping bird. A child's moccasins steam faintly from melted frost. That, too, is part of the night's arithmetic. Never bring wet cold further than the threshold. Let the boundary eat it. The woman at the door tightens one last thong, ties it, and sits back on her heel, satisfied. Around the circle there is slow movement. A grandfather tests the point of an arrowhead with a thumb. He no longer trusts to feel as precisely as it did. A teenager feeds a chip of dried dung to the fire and watches how the flame takes. An infant stirs, then settles as a warm stone is shifted closer. Listen to the sounds that measure warmth. Not the big cackle of logs, but the small hiss when a chip finds the right edge. The tiny ticking of contracting fibers in a drying mitten. The faint lick of smoke as it threads past the ozan and into the cone's throat. Warmth is not a number here. It is a conversation among material. Hide and hair, sinew and willow, stone and ember, breath and draft. The geometry of the lodge matters the cone. The height not as an abstraction, but as a way to give buoyancy to smoke and velocity to air in just the right places. If the night comes hard from the north, the flaps turn their backs and the door hunches. If it circles from the west, the poles speak and the angle changes. There is no dial, there are hands. What you don't see is as important as what you do. You don't see a room sealed like a jar, where air grows old and heavy. You don't see a blaze gulping what it has, and then demanding more, only to choke itself on its own appetite. Instead, the small flame practices what the lodge has learned. Eat slowly, breathe constantly. Carry the heat in muscle and stone and hide. A girl sets a pot to the side, where steam can rise without bullying the draft. The stew is thick with marrow and berries. The steam keeps the air kind to throats and skin. Winter punishes with dryness as much as cold. The pot answers both. The story of warmth in a lodge is not only engineering, though it is that. Elegantly so. It is also law, custom, choreography. Where people sleep is part of the thermal map. Elders and infants near the heart, where radiant heat is tender. Young men further out. The doorway kept tidy so the morning rekindle is smooth. The firekeeper's duties pass like a song, line by line, year to year. Bank the coals with care. Choose fuel for its behavior, not its drama. Turn the stone before it complains. Never let the flaps argue with the wind. The lodge is a teacher that never writes anything down. You learn by watching smoke and listening to silence. Outside, the wind tests the stitching again and finds nothing to boast about. The stars are punishingly clear. Somewhere a coyote names the cold. Inside, the ozan hangs like a soft horizon. Its lower edge is weighted just enough to hold its line. Behind it, the incoming air makes its slow rivet. Cold, becoming less cold, becoming useful. If you slide your hand behind the lining, you can feel the difference. Sharpness smooth to chill, chill smooth to a shrug. In that narrow corridor between skin's outer cover and inner drop, winter is persuaded to behave. Someone smiles at a memory. How the old ones would tilt their heads and read the fire like a face blue, whispering too much air. Yellow pleading for more. Red telling you the stones are ready. A boy once tried to make sparks leap, piling on too much, too fast, until the lodge coughed. The correction was gentle, a hand on his wrist. A story about how a big flame gives only big smoke, and how people and fires both do better when they are not asked to prove themselves every minute. He learned to bank, to cradle, to step away from spectacle. He learned that warmth is not won by conquest, but composed. Now the door thongs creak a little as leather tightens in the night. A grandmother draws her robe around her shoulders, pulls the edge over her ear, and lies back. The warm stone at her feet assures her that hours ahead will not bite. Across the circle, a mother smooths a sleeping child's hair, then reaches for the poles that control the flap. She adjusts them a fraction, and the smoke's braid tightens a ribbon pulled neat. Air has been given its path, the nine its term. You can lie down with this and fall asleep to the system working. Air in low, warmed by manners and lining. Air up high. Smoke chosen and escorted. Heat captured in stone and hide in shared body. If you wake before dawn, and the lodge is a darker shape, you will hear only the crispest of sounds. A coal settling, the thinnest thread of draft, humming along the lining, a sleeping breath turning. You will not be cold, you will not be hot. You will be inside an agreement with winter, an agreement renewed with each small act, the lacing of a door, the aiming of a flap, the turning of a stone, the decision to feed a flame what it can handle, and no more. And when morning leans pale against the east, and the wind changes key, the first hand up will not run. A small stick will test the coals. Another stone will be turned. The flaps will open their eyes. The lodge will inhale, and the day will begin. Warmth will not be something you switch on. It will be something you make, and because you make it together, it will belong to everyone in the circle. Dawn does not so much arrive as lift, like a lid eased off a pot. The color outside is pewter, the snow a crust that creaks under a cautious boot. Breath plumes and folds back against the scar, frosting hair along the cheekbone. The camp is not a single circle, but a constellation. Lodges arranged with sense that reads the wind like script. Openings angled from the night's hardest teeth. Backs shouldered against a cut bank of willow and drifted grass. Cold pools down in low draws, the way water does. Someone older chose a bench that sees the sun early and sheds the worst of that pooling. Even here, inches matter. Warmth is partly geography, partly the disagreement you sustain with it. First chores are a quiet mart. You go for fuel because a lodge's belly must be kept humble and fed often. Wood is not a thing you throw at a problem until it submits. On these plains, wood is a relationship and sometimes a rumor. Cottonwood, when you find it winter dead and seasoned by the sky, gives a coal that lasts and asks for dignity in return. But more often, the day leans on what the buffalo left behind. Dried dung chips are the plainest, most faithful servants of warmth, light to carry. clean to handle once properly weathered, and polite in the smoke they make. The work is learning, with your fingers, the difference between a chip that will burn through the long mouth of evening and one that will sulk or hiss. A woman's hand reaches into a drift where the wind has banked chips like cards. She presses a thumbnail lightly into the edge. Good chips resist with a dry, woody give, and they ring against each other, not thump. Too fresh, and they hold the memory of grass too tightly. Too old, and they crumble to dust at a breath. The best of them come from herds that fed well on mixed prairie. She can tell by scent so faint you'd swear it's imagined sunbaked, grassy, clean. She stacks them in a parfleche that has known this work for years, the raw hide polished where it rests against a hip. A young boy copies her test, gets scolded only with a laugh when his nail goes too deep and the chip splits. This, too, is apprenticeship, calibrating touch until judgment lives in the skin itself. The cottonwoods by the creek hold their own counsel. Their bark is scored high by past floods that shoved ice into them like a file. A dead branch spots the pale sky and breaks off in the mind long before it's ready to be taken. Better to read the grain at the trunk to know which limb offered itself last summer and now, feathered by frost, will accept a saw's modest request. Nothing green is wasted for heat. Heat is a ledger, and today's warmth must not steal from next year's shade. A man kneels to slice thin rounds from a branch already down. Quick coins for the fire that will catch a chip and teach it the color of flame. The path back to camp is a skein of tracks, new over old. Where the wind scoured clean, the snow lies like hammered tin. Where it eddied, it folded soft dunes that the hips remember. Frost beads on the lashes. The mouth learns to use less air, draws it deep and slow so the chest does not ache. Elders taught tricks that sound like superstition until they prove themselves again. Keep the breath through the nose to take the edge off. Keep a bit of cloth over lips. When the wordless air wants to bite the throat, keep silence. It warms more than Thaw. As the sun works its thin blade along the eastern seam, the lodges begin their small gesture. A smoke flap twitches and settles. A doorway unlaces, and the hide is rolled slow, letting the first rustle of air in, as one would let a skittish horse into a pen. Sounds travel farther in this weather, an axe tapping, distant laughter, a dog's single, offended bark. The camp becomes visible to itself. Children are sent out with baskets for chips and come back with faces hot and heroic. They learn to read the ground as if it were a page that changes language every 15 steps. Snow that lies hard over a low swale means the wind bled it. Look to the upstream side of a lone sage for chips gathered by chance. A patch of willows with rabbit sign promises twigs and the pellets that say coyotes fed. And where coyotes feed, the ground is kicked open to smaller treasures. When the parfleche is full enough to tug at the shoulder, care returns to the threshold. The boundary is a rule. Shake the snow from everything that has been loyal to the outside. Lay chips near the door where their cold can leak into the air river behind the ozan before they meet the fire. That cold will travel low along the wall, rounding its edge against the lining's soft edge, then step into the hearth's circle temper. Inside is not piously sealed from the world. Inside has simply taught the world how to behave upon entry. The day's first tending is not dramatic. A small stick worries the ash until a sly glow answers. A fan of chips 3. Not more goes on in a patient hinge that lets air thread between them. The cottonwood coins wait at the side to char and offer a coal's spine. A young man watches, hands eager. The urge to coax a bigger blaze showing in the angle of his shoulders. The firekeeper does not chide. She tells a story about a distant winter where a family burned their heat too fast at sundown and slept in smoke they made themselves, waking with scratched throats and smarting eyes. The lodge grudging in the morning. He learns from her posture that a small fire is a promise kept, that chips are to be courted, not conquered. Around midday the wind slips and loses its barbed certainty. Sun throws a shallow hand into the lodge, and the air brightens to a pallor that feels like a favor. From another lodge, a pot sends a ribbon of steam that smells of marrow and chokecherry. The cook has set it just to the side of the flame, so the simmer feels like thinking, not anger. In this light, the ozan is clearly a boundary that also keeps the camp a family of lung. Each lodge breathing its own careful rhythm, each draft tune, each smoke braid rising, separate but kin. You can walk between lodges and feel the little microclimates, one with the door rolled a bit higher to please an infant's cough, another with flaps trimmed narrow to placate an elder's joint. Toward afternoon, a storm line shows itself as a bruise along the western rim. Everyone reads it. Everyone moves a fraction faster without announcing alarm. Chips are topped up, the good stones flawless, rounded, without seams that would spit when heated are brought near the hearth. A boy is sent for water before the trail becomes opinionated with drift. A woman unrolls an extra hide and tests the laces on the winter door. The poles that govern the smoke flaps are checked where they cross. Rawhide thongs can grow stubborn in sudden cold, and it is better to coax them now than curse them later. This is not panic. It is choreography built over season, wearing a face so ordinary that strangers fail to see the science in it. Snow begins as ash few, light, exploratory, and then commit. The wind returns with a new note that speaks of fetch and long attention. Inside, the fire is banked to a heart that will carry through the first press of the blow. Chips are stacked like books within a hand's reach. Someone warms a stone and tucks it into a fur-lined pouch beside the place where the elder sleeps. The pouch will leak heat for hours. Kindness placed ahead of need. The door is laced down to a slit that breathes. The ozan hangs true, its lower edge weighted so it does not flutter and offend the draft. In the half-light, the lodge feels like a chest, ribs and breath and a pulse you can trust. If you step back out into the storm for a minute, the camp is both vulnerable and sure. Drifts begin to sketch new maps against the cones of hide. Dogs brace themselves and grin into it, tails making their own flag language. The creek's edge fusses with ice. A figure moving from lodge to lodge lean. Angle learned from 1,000 crossing. When she reaches the last door, she shakes the white from her hair, pulls in, and the door laces with a final tidy insistence that says, enough. What remains to be done now is patience. Inside, the talk slows to the body's pace. Hands finish what the morning began. A seam's last path, a bead's last reflection of light. A bowstring eased with a smudge of fat to keep it honest. The storm writes a coarse music above scratch, sigh. A fist opening and closing against hide. The flaps are at their narrowest, and yet the air remains young. The draft still travels its path, quiet as a habit. When the chips are offered, they take with a modest flame. When the cottonwood coin goes on, the coal lengthens the hearth's memory into the coming dark. The boy who wanted blaze has settled into the pleasure of tending what lasts. Night will close with the storm still at work. And you may believe, listening, that warmth is a small miracle. It is not. It is 100 small obediences to what the world asks and what a lodge can teach back. Gather what burns clean. Move where the air moves kindly. Read the ground and sky as if they have your name in them. Let the lining make a river that accepts winter without letting it rule. Feed the fire the size of your need, not your fear. This is how a camp outlives weather and wakes with cheeks pink and eyes clear, surprised that the cold had such a loud voice and so little to say. By dusk, the lodge shows its logic like a hand-turned palm. The floor is the first teacher. Willow wand, cut when sap slept, have been woven into mats that flex but do not crouch. They lift the body's heat away from ground that remembers night, even at noon. Over the mats lie hides, thick along the spine. Softer at the flanks laid hair down where grip is welcome, and hair up where a cradle is kind. The smell is clean smoke, animal fat, a sweetness of willow that blooms when warmed. Beneath the central ring of stones, a shallow bowl of earth keeps the fire honest. The stones are not decorative. They are a pacemaker, holding heat, smoothing flame, and reminding sparks where the circle ends. The hearth's flame is the size of a hand. It speaks more in ember than in tongue. Big fires brag and then ask for apology. This one is a conversation you can join without raising your voice. The stones were chosen like friends, rounded by a river, dense without seams that would betray them to steam, precious enough to be carried when the camp moves. They are arranged with memory. A long one to the north, where drafts can be sharper. A low, wide one to the west, so a pot can find a steady seat. Along the inner edge, a shallow shelf of ash accumulates a gray sea that lets a coal be buried and lifted at need. A bank you can draw from without begging. Around this heart, people become a map of care. The elders take the radiant, not the glare, sleeping where heat arrives as patience rather than argument. Infants and the newly mended lie, where a turned stone can pour its hour-long kindness through hide and robe. Young men and women take the cool outer arc. They own more heat in their blood and more pride in their shoulders. Near the door lies a tidy lane that is not to be trespassed when dark is deep. In the morning, this is where the first hand moves to coax coals to confession and trade breath with the flaps. The lane stays clear so that warmth can resume without rummaging. What seems like custom is also physics in disguise. The ozan inner lining hangs from measured points on the poles and drops to a line just above the sitting backs, weighted with small stones wrapped in hide so it does not flirt with draft. Behind it, the low river of air continues its faithful work, taking the sting from outside and taming it. You can feel its presence with the back of your hand, a coolness that does not accuse. Above, where the cone narrows, heat gathers not as a trap but as a pathfinder. The smoke flaps hide ears tied to poles that translate thought into angle. Decide whether smoke rolls and sulks or threads itself in a quick, dark braid toward night. The one who tends them reads wind the way a singer reads a drum, not by the eye, but by a pressure at the cheek, a message on the skin. When the lodge settles into evening, the sounds compose a small, exact orchestra. The shy sand of ash when a coal shift, leather laces creaking as the door is eased and tied. The combing rasp of bone on sinew when someone draws a seam tight, a baby's sigh answering a stone's exhale through hide. An old man's cough that is not a complaint, only a punctuation that says the air is young. The draft, obedient. Even a dog's dream-foot scratching carries information. The night's peace has room for such narrative. Now the grandfather works by the hearth, his knees folded to a patience the young pretend to disdain and then envy. Arrow-making is not a single act, but a chain of true choices. He holds a shaft that first knew itself as a willow shoot in the green month. It was straightened with steam, slept bound to a true stick, and learned to be obedient without losing spring. His thumb, flattened at the pad from a lifetime of such persuasions, tests the run of the grain. A coal is lifted and nestled near the raw point. He blows not with a gust, but with a quiet syllable of breath that carries heat exactly where he wants it. The wood chars to a black kiss. The knife, bone-handled and candid about its edge, hurries the char away. The point emerges not by force, but by admission. Feathers lie ready, 3 from the same wing, all either left or right, so the spin will agree, and the arrow will not argue with itself in flight. Sinew, teased fine and laid wet against the shaft, shrinks as it dries, biting down with a strength you might mistake for sorcery if you did not know the logic of tendon. A smear of hide glue, pale and faintly sweet, fixes what respect has placed. Under his fingernails, the old man carries the archive of a camp. Smoke, fat, glue, willow dust. He does not look up much, not because he is unfriendly, but because looking down tells his hands what to do. Children know the moment to come closer without intruding. They feel the draft of attention, the way its wind backs and fills when a lesson is underway. He sets a point, stone or traded metal depending on the season's luck, and binds it with a spiral that is almost music. The boy from the morning who learned that hunger for blaze makes smoke, not heat watches, breath hitching and then smoothing as the work's rhythm enters him. Outside, the wind braids snow along the lodge's ribs, and the flaps answer by a hair. Inside, the arrow grows like a song played under one's breath. This is not an old craft kept for nostalgia. It is the evening's engineering, as precise as the woman's tuning of flap and lining, as essential as the firekeeper's math with chips and cottonwood coin. Meals are part of the math. The pot sits where its simmer does not bully the draft half in warmth, half in patience. Meat loosens itself from bone at the same rate time loosens stories from lips. A ladle moves sunwise around the circle. In each bowl, warmth arrives as flavor and as pardon for the day's small errors. Fat floats in golden eyes at the surface and is invited back into the body with gratitude. A pinch of berry puts brightness into the mouth and reminds the tongue that winter has memory of summer trapped inside it. Children, taught to feel heat before owning it, cradle their bowls on folded hides so they do not scald the flesh that keeps them nimble. The door is not simply shut. It is laced with intention. Cross thongs draw hide to hide, so the seam becomes a line of mutual good behavior rather than a challenge to whine. Now and then a hand tests it, finds a softness that means a thong has stretched. and answers with a quiet cinch. Above, the poles talk in their slender language, creak and settle, relaying the storm's mood to the floor in murmurs that mean nothing needs doing. A long, low stone is rolled a finger's width to keep the elder's feet cheerful. No one announces this. The body knows who needs what. The map of seating was drawn in the morning and is annotated by acts through the day. If you stood at the threshold and looked in, you would not see technology in any way. The word is often meant. The devices here are not ostentatious. They are tuned tolerances, conserved lessons, the humility to let materials declare their gifts, hide stitched with sinew that shrinks to seal, stones that accept fire and then loan it back, a lining that creates a hallway for cold to turn into work, a door that is both a mouth and a vow, a flame trimmed to a size that makes more heat than pride, and people who take their places not by commandment, but by the simple physics of care. When the time comes to bank the coals, nobody looks at a clock. Ash is drawn in a soft drift over red. A single chip no more goes on to whisper through the first hours after talk is done. The flaps find their night angle, a gesture so slight that a stranger would call it nothing. Hands ease into robes. Stones are set like planets on their small orbits of heat. Breath falls into a common meter. The lodge darkens from amber to ember, to the faintest stipple of star-colored coal. The sounds reduce to that lovely sum you already know. A coal's sigh hides slow breathing. A child's sleep laugh. The old man lays the finished arrow on a peg above his head, where memory can see it first thing at dawn. Outside, winter holds its argument. Inside, the answer is already written in circle and seam. The lodge is not against the cold. It is with the cold, and therefore warmer than defiance can ever be. Here, at the measured center, a small flame tends a nation of stone, hides, breaths, and habits. The map of the circle keeps everyone inside its weather. And because each element knows where to be and how to behave, the night can go on for as long as the sky requires, without any of you falling out of it. Sometime after the first long quiet, the firekeeper wakes as if a string has been plucked somewhere above the cone, and the vibration has reached the bones. There is no command and no clock, only the felt knowledge that an ember's face has thinned to a veil, and the draft wants a hand to keep its promise. She turns within her robe, careful not to tug the air into noise, and sits up into the kind of darkness that is not empty, but inhabited by breath, by sleeping shoulders under hide, by the faint grammar of ash as it settled. Her palm goes to the floor first, reading the temperature that the mats have stored. Warm, but farther from the hearth, a cool is approaching on soft feet. Time to bang, time to guide, time to be small and exact. The lane by the door is clear as ever. Saved in daylight for this, so she can kneel without groping. She unties the outer thong at her waist and uses it to bind cuffs above her wrists, so hide will not lick flame if she must reach close. The hearth, when she unhoods it with a gentle hand, shows the precise red of work left unfinished, not the hospital red of panic, nor the black of surrender. A country of coals with one or two bright towns at the windward edge, and a drift of pale ash that can be made into blanket. She lifts ash with her stick and lets it sift over the most active glow until the red softens to cherry. Then, from the parfleche by the door, she chooses 3 chips and no more. Grated by touch in the hours before dusk, their edges clean, their bodies dry as old paper. She sets them in a small, fanned hinge, space between them where the draft can speak. They do not flare, they accept. It is not performant, it is a meal. Above, the smoke flaps are only a finger's angle from clothes. Wind writes in them like a teacher behind your shoulder, tracing a lesson in pressure. She takes the crossed pole in her hands and listens with cheeks and hairline for what the night currently believes about itself. A hair's adjustment, and the mound and the low river of incoming cold continues to travel behind the ozan and into the hearth at its polite height. She does not need to see the smoke to know it has resumed its braid. She hears the draft's soft thread again and feels on the lids of her eyes the tiniest caress of rising warmth. A lodge says yes or no in a dozen languages, most of them learned by skin. Behind her, the sleepers stir without waking. A foot finds a stone and is reassured. A cough tests the air and retires. A child rolls until cheek meets the soft hill of a robe and makes a small, satisfied sound that contains a whole winter of promises. The firekeeper draws one of the wrapped stones nearer the hearth's lip so it can swallow more of the ember's slow speed. Then, with the same forked stick, eases a second stone to the elder's feet. It is not hot, it is right. Heat that scolds is not warmth. Heat that converses is. Banking is not only ash on coals, it is the discipline not to propose a blaze where a murmur is better. It is the sense of what the hour asks, the knowledge of how much draught a narrower night can accept and still be young in the lungs. In a corner of the lodge, the pot that has whispered all evening now sleeps with its lid cocked open like a listening ear. A finger to the metal tells her it is still warm enough to keep the air's kindness alive. She will set it closer at dawn, so steam will soften throats before the first word is said. Outside, the storm's paw continues to press and release against the hide. The poles answer in their tall voices, creaks like old doorways. Not unhappy, just speaking. She checks the door's lacing with her hand, not her eyes, tightening a thong that stretched during evening's raveling of stories. The seam becomes again a line, hide to hide, each hole acknowledging the next. Along the lower edge of the ozan, the small wrapped weights keep it from flirting with drafts. She slides her hand behind the lining and feels that faithful corridor of cool, not knife-edged now but honest. It flows like a docile stream along the wall and rounds itself before entering the room's breath. This is why there is no frost bloom on lips, why elders do not wake with a needle in the chest. The lodge does not hoard air, it teaches air to behave. She returns to the hearth and lays a cottonwood coin at the hinge's side off to one edge, where it can char and lengthen the coal's memory into an hour. She will spend asleep. A whisper of blue answers, then becomes the quiet orange of a truth told without drama. She lifts ash again, a careful veil to keep the chip's dignity and the draft's courtesy in balance. Behind her, someone mutters a dream that has no noun, only a string of syllables that sound like the old names of rivers. The dog near the door, ambassador to every weather, sighs and goes deeper under its tail. Now comes the choreography that is less seen than felt, the communal adjustment of sleeping bodies to match the fire's new arithmetic. Without order, without spoken command, the circle edits itself. The elder's knees, already blessed by the stone, curl a little less. The mother with the child shifts so that also her back, not the child, faces the door slim. A young shoulder in the outer arc pulls a robe corner down over a wrist that cooled while ash was lifting. None of this is noble. It is merely what bodies do when a space is designed to ask the right question of winter, and winter answers with respect. The firekeeper rests her palm over the coals, high enough to read, but not to be read by them. A tiny pulse of heat presses into the skin and tells her what she needs to know. She looks once more to the flaps and makes one last, nearly imaginary change. Then she lies back and becomes part of the map again. Her place in the circle, a small bend in the room's invisible isotherms. Her breath, one more metronome, counting down the night's agreement with itself. Midnight elongates. The storm throws a handful of ice and then reconsiders. The cone of the lodge is an instrument the wind plays without damaging. Occasionally, a flake finds its way to the rim of the smoke hole and hisses when it meets the slightest heat. The sound is not even a complaint, only a syllable in a conversation too old to be impatient anymore. Somewhere in the dark, a rope of sinew fibers tightens by a whisker as the humidity shifts. A bead flashes, then forgets it did. A coal slides with the littlest sigh and arranges its neighbors. If something goes wrong, a sudden gust that bullies the flaps, a chip that smokes out of stubbornness correction, is swift and tender. The pole hand turns with the wrist, letting the wind claim what it wanted all along, a path. The sulking chip is nudged closer to a coal so it can learn how to conduct itself among adults. A little ash here, a little lift there, patience everywhere. Trouble, when met in such scale, forgets its appetite for drama. The old man wake. Age has made pact with the night. He will let it have more of his hours if he can have more of its textures. He listens, not for danger, for competence. The lodge replies with evidence. The draft carries the right cool along the lining. The fire's center is low and true. The door's seam does not tremble. The stones give back their held day. He tests his own feet against a pouch and smiles at how the heat has become almost a character in the family, arriving when called and never taking offense when repositioned. He dozes again with an arrow's ghost in his hand, shaping a point in dream where the knife is thought, toward the last quarter, when even the storm seems a little ashamed of its earlier volume. The firekeeper wakes for the second tending. This is the moment for kindness that will bloom at dawn. She bears the coals again with the ash sticks back, helps them confess their heart, and offers 2 chips no more, so that the first riser will find a lodge already thinking about morning. She sets the pot a little nearer to anticipate the gentle steam the day will want. Then she warms 1 more stone, wraps it, and tucks it by the spot where the child's feet have inevitably escaped their robe. The child's body retreats with a sigh that is nearly a lap. That sound will carry her through half the winter. Before lying back, she leans to the flaps and gives them the day's smallest gift. A pre-dawn angle, anticipating the wind's change when the eastern light begins to lift and the world's pressure shifts with it. This is not superstition. Dawn is physics with a blush. The lodge likes to be ready. She lays the stick so it will be found without searching. She draws her robe to her ear and lets the circle claim her again. And you, if you were here and not simply listening, would feel the country of warmth extend a little farther into the dark. As if the room had grown 1 more ring like a tree, you would understand that heat is not a thing kept, but a road maintained. Stones heated, coals banked, ash lifted and lay, flaps tuned, door laced, bodies arranged according to need and season. No one action is grand. The sum is grand. The sum is why a lodge can be a small star under the violence of weather, and why those inside it wake without bitterness in their throats. When dawn reaches for the seam of the world, again, the lodge will accept it without being surprised. The first riser will find the coals willing, the draft where it should be, and the pot ready to speak. The winter door will unlatch without protest. The snow outside will tally what the storm declared and what it could not enforce. And the circle will rise, stretch, and take up the day as if the night had been a friendly argument with a very old friend, and the conclusion had never really been in doubt. Morning has a way of finding the hands that remember. In this camp, knowledge moves mostly along the quiet road from one woman's wrists to another's. The lodge may be read by anyone who cares to look, but its grammar, its particular fluency and warmth, belongs to those who stitch, scrape, lift, and tune until matter behaves. Ask the poles who makes winter honest, and they would point, if they could, to the woman by the door with an awl and a length of sinew threaded double, tugging a seam until hide lies. To hide like 2 good neighbors, it begins long before snow. In the light months, the work sets its foundations. Hides are taken when the animals are fat, and the hair is right for what is needed. Thicker spines to face the weather. Softer flanks to cradle sleep. Select panels cut from the back where the grain will bear the pull of lacing without fussing. Brain tanning is not a charm, but a conversation with oils and fibers. A niece learns to warm the mashed brain, not to a boil. Never to a boil, but to the temperature the back of the wrist agrees with. She learns the smell that says, ready, not sharp, not bland. A nut sweetness with a ghost of smoke, if last year's pot has told its story well. The high, fleshed clean with a scraping tool that keeps its angle like a promise, drinks the emulsion and begins to soften. Later, when it is worked over a beam with strength that comes from hips more than shoulders, the fibers open. The way mouths open to laughter among people who trust each other. Sinew is a lesson in patience disguised as threat. Cut from leg or back strap and teased apart with a thumbnail, then dried and pounded until it loosens into honest fibers. It becomes a cord that answers water by tightening like a decision. Bone needles honed on sandstone. Eyes drilled with the stubborn tenderness of someone who intends to use this tool for years pass through. Punched holes spaced by an awl that knows what even feels like. The niece learns to bite the thread lightly, to hold it while both hands coax a seam tight. She learns that wetting the sinew too much makes it sulk, not enough and it will bark when it dry. She learns to set knots where the wind will never find them, and to roll a seam under so melt runnels in spring cannot tease it apart. Come autumn, patterns are drawn that are not quite patterns, as a paperworker would mean. They are maps that remember poles and the way a particular family builds a cone. 12 to 20 feet names for sizes that become in the hand, lengths of thong, spans of forearm, the distance between the shoulder and the ground. When a woman kneels to check a hem, not all lodges are made alike, and no one pretends they are. Nations have their ways, families their preferences. What repeats is the habit of design that admits wind and coaxed smoke and makes a room that welcomes sleeping bodies without interrogating them. The woman marks the smoke flap's corners with a sense for how they will catch a pole's turning thought in January. She reinforces the places the lacing will ask most of the hide, doubling patches like a mother folding an extra layer over a child's ribs. When they fall asleep too near the door, inside, the lining call it ozan here, because that is the word these mouths were given to use. Knowing other mouths elsewhere choose other names hangs from measured loops. The niece learns that pretended symmetry offends a lodge more than an honest accommodation to the memory of the hides. She watches her aunt lift the lining a finger higher on the north side. Because the wind in this valley almost always has a habit of that quarter at dusk. She watches her aunt weight the lower edge with small wrapped stones so the lining will not flirt with the draft. And she stores in her body the pleased way the air behaves when the corridor behind the ozan is smooth and obedient. Stories are told like stitches, looping back to catch what holds. The women in this lodge speak of others they have met or heard of, people whose houses were different and yet answered the weather with the same genius. Earth lodges whose massive ribs keep a winter so gentle that infants dream long dreams. Bark houses that ask spring to behave. Plank structures near rain. Coasts that listen to wet better than a flatland shelter ever could. In accounts like those later recorded from Buffalo Bird woman Maxidiwiak of the Hidatsa, one hears the clear, exact intelligence of a woman who could describe how a household works, from seeds to soup to storage, without ever putting on a theater about it. The niece hears these names and understands that the world is wide in its solutions, that humility is the only tool that never breaks, and that their lodge is one answer among many good ones. She is taught to speak carefully about what she has not seen. Certainty travels poorly. In late fall, the needles begin to know the weight of winter, and the seams receive their last apology. The door, the winter door that will be laced tight at dusk, gets its double edge and its cross thong. The niece practices lacing and unlacing with her eyes shut, then in a wind, then with a child clinging to her knee, because all these conditions will be there when it matters. The poles are sorted and paired so their strengths complement, not compete. There are poles that like to be near the flaps, and poles that prefer to lean hard and then keep quiet. She learns to hear their opinions through the creak that travels from cone to floor in the first real blow of the season. On a day of tray, a sliver of iron arrived, and the old knife with a bone handle is granted a younger sibling with a thirstier edge. The women try it, admire it, then put it away for when it is needed. Stone and bone will still do their work. Tools in this camp do not replace each other, as much as they join the circle with equal manners. The niece realizes the same is true of knowledge. A new trick about flap angle learned from a lodge 2 valleys away will not crowd out what her grandmother taught her about reading a fire's color. Both can live in one pair of hands without quarreling. Winter tests what summer built. Snow loads the cover and asks whether the seams were honest. Wind interrogates the smoke flaps and looks for cowardice. The niece, now with a loop of children at her ankles, learns the night tending that keeps a room young. She keeps the pot where the simmer does not bully the draft. She places stones according to the map of a sleeping circle that rearranges itself as elders heal or coughs require different accommodations. She shakes chips from their sacks as if counting blessings and sets them in the hinge that teaches flame moderation. She looks outward when she adjusts the flap, listening to the invisible river at the cheekbones where pressure speaks first, and inward when she lays at, remembering that a bank is not a burial but a promise. Some nights the elder by the door whispers a name for what they do that contains neither craft nor science, and yet means both. Warmth, she said, is a relationship. You do not dominate it. You keep it friendly. You do not hoard it. You invite it to sit with everyone, and you make introductions. Stone to foot, draft to ember, hide to hide, story to sleep. If the child wakes with cold toe, you do not curse the storm. You move the stone. If smoke sulked, you do not blame the wood. You change the angle, and the behavior changes with it. The niece feels pride rise and then pass. The work is not hers alone. In this lodge, apprenticeship does not end with a speech. It ends the way a season does by turning into the next, without fuss. The niece becomes the woman at the door, not because someone declared it, but because her hands tell the truth too consistently to ignore. One evening, as a storm rehearses beyond the creek, she checks the lacing and thinks of women she has never seen and will never meet. The Hidatsa farmers whose granaries outlasted blizzards because the women who kept them were engineers. The women along a northern river whose fish-skin parkas kept sleet from colonizing the body. The families under great timber roofs where smoke stains speak the language of generations. She feels, not for the first time, that human warmth has been one long conversation, carried by those who rarely got to sign their names beside its paragraphs. Later, when the camp moved, the lodge becomes a bundle, poles a quiver, hides a folded biography. The niece-turned-aunt shows a younger girl how to read wear in the seams and how to oil a place that fret. She tells her that no two setups are truly the same because no two winds repeat themselves exactly, and because the circle of sleeping bodies is a new document every time. She tells her to be suspicious of certainty and loyal to observation. She tells her that warmth belongs to the whole lodge, or it isn't warmth at all. Night comes early that day, and the new aunt sits where her own aunt once sat, just inside the door, spine against a pole that understands the language of creek. She threads sinew by touch and listens as the room tells her what it wants. A little more ash here, a coin of cottonwood turned there, a flap's angle confessed by the soft cooling of her cheeks. The child asleep at her hip has one foot uncovered. Children are true to that habit in every latitude, and she tucks a wrapped stone near the heel without waking anyone. It is the smallest ceremony, the bravest magic. The way warmth is passed like a bowl and never spilled. Across the circle, the old man lifts his finished arrow from its peg to admire it in the last honey of the firelight. He nods without looking at her, not because he does not see it, but because seeing is old here and needs few words. The lodge exhales. The draft takes what it needs and gives back what it should. Knowledge keeps its promise through a woman's hands, and the night, which seemed hostile to the idea of mercy early in the season, settles into one more negotiated peace. Before a lodge can quarrel kindly with winter, it must be a skin that understands its own tensions. Cover begins with choosing what will one day pretend to be weather and usually succeeds. Hides taken when animals were strong. Hair thick enough to argue with sleep, grain tight enough to keep a seam from confessing under pull. The woman who measures by forearm and thumb sets aside panels with an eye for where stress will accumulate. The crown where poles kiss. The door seam asked to obey every dusk. The lacing edge that must receive and return force hundreds of times without sulking. She is part tailor, part surveyor, part negotiator speaking both hide and win. Brain tanning, told plain, is chemistry performed with memory rather than numbers. The emulsion carries fats and lecithins that slip between collagen fibers and teach them flexibility. Too hot, and the emulsion scolds the fiber. Too cool, and it whispers without effect. The right heat is measured at the tender skin behind the wrist, and by a smell nut sweet, low, honest, that a child will learn long before she can explain it. After soaking comes the long persuasion, stretching over a beam, pulling not with the shoulders alone, but with the hips. Rhythm steady so the fibers open like a stubborn fist relaxing. Smoke later seals what oil granted, turning the skin into a weather-tolerant companion. The hue it takes is not a vanity, but a record of protection. Sinew will do the rest. Cut from leg or backstrap, pounded and teased into clean strands. It loves water enough to swell, loves air enough to shrink. This shrinking is the lodge's secret tailor. Stitches laid right will tighten in dry weather and hold a seam as if in a small, constant embrace. The woman spaces her awl holes so the hide does not tear. She rolls the seam under where meltwater will travel in spring. Knots live where the wind will never find them. If she must use a traded thread linen, or later something more glittering, she still calls on sinew where the door and flaps will be tested, trusting what answers humidity with help instead of complaint. When the hides are ready, patterning is less a template than a remembered conversation with poles and ground. A 12-foot lodge for a small family, a 20 for a larger circle. These are not absolute, only sizes that translate to how many people will sleep temperate and how many will tend the fire without stepping on dreams. The cover is cut as a broad sector that will wrap the cone, with a top that knows where the pole bundle will stand, and a bottom that meets earth with enough mercy to shed melt without gathering puddles. She chalks with measures by spans elbow to wrist, hand to hand, and tests her thinking with a mock lacing. Pins standing in for rawhide thong. A cousin holds one edge, a niece holds the other. The body tells them if the wrap will lie true or pull sulky at the crown. Stress mapping, without using that phrase, is everywhere in her choices. Along the lacing edge, she doubles small patches, not to make a wall, but to give holes. Honest shoulders so they won't tear when wind tugs. Where the smoke flaps will be. Triangular reinforcements sit like quiet witnesses, prepared for the torque of poles. The door seam accepts a second line of stitching, so winter's laces can draw hide to hide, without asking the seam to be brave alone. Even the grain of each panel is read in honor. Back pieces, denser and less elastic, climb the areas that will bear the pull. Belly side pieces take the quieter fields. When set on poles, the cover becomes a study in load paths. Gravity wants to slide the world down the cone. The lacing edge and the crown take that ambition and manage it. Wind wants to translate itself into flapping. The smoke flaps, and the lacing knobs convert that into angle and tautness. The woman can feel, through the pole set in the cover's hand, when a wrinkle is a mere vanity and when it is a future problem. She plucks it like a string and hears potential trouble as a dull note. A small shift at the crown. Half a hand to the east makes a crease vanish and a draft improve. She is orchestrating tolerances in a medium that forgives nothing, and yet yields to those who listen. Hair remains or not, by need. Winter covers often retain hair outward, where it turns sleek. A million tiny brooms that flick the sky's arguments away. Inside, where bodies will brush, hair may be scraped clean to keep the room from becoming a coat. These choices lay hair out up high for weather, hair in near the ground. Only where a cradle is kind. There is no single rule across nations. Each valley, each herd, each family teaches its own best compromise. The woman's sentences about this are modest. For this wind, for this winter, here is how we will do it. Now to the smoke flaps, the lodge's ears and weather reader. They are not decorative crescents, but sails whose cut matters. Too small and smoke sulks, too large and gusts pry. Their corners are reinforced because the pole's thought will travel through these corners every hour the wind has an opinion. The cords that let them pivot are tied so a hand can change angle in a breath, even when that hand is numb. The woman drills the flap holes a little high because she knows cord will creep. She will not give winter that inch for free. Her attention then drops to the ozan, the inner lining. For cover alone does not make a climate. The lining's cut is lower, and its edge weighted in tiny hide-wrapped stones. Distance from the ground is measured by sitting backs. A lining that tickles heads is worse than one too low. Suspended from loops taken on the inside of the poles, it establishes the draft's corridor, the low, cool river that will enter at the base and hand itself, tamed to the coals. She lifts the north edge by a finger to answer the valley's usual evening pressure. A local truth that no traveling diagram would ever guess. In that small asymmetry lives the difference between a coughing night and a clear one. Cover and lining finished. She steps back and tests the system with her senses. She has no meter, only a face that reads pressure and a hand that can feel the difference between hostile cold and useful chill. A handspan behind the ozan. She sets a small fire, no larger than humility, and watches how smoke chooses to live. It should plait itself in a quick, thin braid, if it loll. The flaps are sulking, or the lining has an arrogance somewhere along its hem. She walks the circumference, palm grazing the air as one might read a wall for leak, where the cover kisses the ground. She wants no draft-sharp sting, only the faint, honest cool of air on its way to become work. A seam that frets gets a whisper of fat. A tongue of hide that flutters gets another pebble in its hem. Materials talk back. On damp days, the cover swells and the seam grows content on brittle cold. Everything sharpens and begs for slack. She anticipates both, leaving a generosity in lacing that can be taken up at dusk and let out in the bright hours. Poles move a hair as the cone settles. The crown needs checking after the first snow low. Nothing is finished. Everything is in practice. If traded cloth comes through camp canvas from a fort, say someone will wonder aloud. Cloth has its conveniences. Fewer seams, less weight when wet. It has, too, a different honesty with fire and a different accent when wind speaks. The woman does not mock it and does not enthrone it. She notes how it behaved, where it frays, how it holds a stitch. She keeps her truths portable. Covers are agreements, not dogmas. The agreement must include the climate, the fuel, the family, the season, the hands that will tend it at 3 in the morning. At last, in full winter dress, the lodge shows what the cover has become. Not a wall, but a tuned membrane. Translating weather into pressure, the flaps can reason with. Translating ground into a boundary that knows melt and squeak and the patience of frost. The door hangs on its double edge. The lacing knobs feel strong under the fingers. The smoke hole looks like a decision rather than a wound. Inside, warmth is free to be itself, a small fire that does not boast, stones that collect daylight and spend it at night, breaths that stay young, because the air is never allowed to grow stale. The woman wipes her knife on a patch already smoked a shade darker by work and sits to watch the draft speak past her cheek. It says the same thing. It always says when the cover is honest. Yes. At first light, the lining looks like nothing, a second skin inside the first. A gentle horizon drawn around the lodge at the height of a seated back, yet it is the lodge's grammar. The rule that gives each sentence of air its subject and verb. Without it, smoke sulk. Heat forgets its manner, and winter sharpens its elbows. With it, cold arrives as material, not insult. It is fed to the fire in a civil way and leaves through the smoke hole with purpose rather than tantrum. People call it many names, and each name carries a valley's memory. Here, ozan will do. Inner lining hung from the poles on loops that were measured with hands, that also remembered where elders sit and where a child will kick a heel in sleep. It is cut not from pride but from accuracy, too high, and it scolds shoulders and interrupts talk, too low. And the river of cold sneaks into the room before it has been taught. The edge is weighted with little stones sewn in hide so it will not flirt and flap when the draft speaks. If a stranger asks why the stone, the answer is a palm lifted flat, because air needs a thing to push against. What the lining makes is a hallway between skin, a corridor where outside air can put away its knives and become a traveler with business. Through the small gap at ground, never seal, always honest cold slips in low. It takes the long walk behind the ozan, softening its edge as it goes, circling the lodge like a pilgrim tracing a shrine. By the time it steps out into the hearth circle, it is no longer an enemy to lungs. It is labor. The fire receives it, and in return the smoke. Now quick and sure, chooses the smoke hole rather than the people who have offered it work. Each day begins with calibration you could miss if you were untaught. A woman lifts the edge of the ozan by a finger's thickness at the north side. Because this valley's pressure often leans from that quarter at dawn, she resets a wrap stone where a child tugged the hem in dreams. She runs her palm a handspan behind the lining and reads the air in that corridor as if it were a book too sharp, too dull, or right. Right feels like cool water on summer wrists, refreshing, not biting. Then she goes to the flap, takes the crossed poles in her hand, and listens with her face. The cheeks measure what the eyes cannot, where the wind has hidden itself, whether it intends a steady sentence or a string of questions. A breath's change of angle answers in the lodge below. You could watch the smoke and get the same news. But the flaps tell their truth first to the skin. Sometimes the ozan is not a complete belt, but a series of panels, overlapped so they can be lifted, where a cradle needs a softer draft, or dropped where an elder's cough is better served by air that keeps to its lane. The family knows the map by memory. In storms, panels go down, weights pulled closer to the ground. In warm spells, a gap is allowed, where the door's lane will be most polite. Even the door has a little lining of its own, an inner flap that catches the inside air and keeps it from gutting itself every time someone goes out to read the sky. A visitor once asked where the technology is, meaning the cleverness that comes in metal and angles. The woman smiled and tapped the hem, where the tiny wrapped stones sit like patient teeth. There, she said, and there. She meant that a thing that works does not need to shout. The lining is technology turned into etiquette. It teaches air to speak softly and smoke to stand up straight. By mid-morning, when cooking has put polite steam into the room, the ozan does its second work. It keeps the room from becoming a stew of its own. The steam rises and joins the smoke in the updraft, leaving humidity that pleases throats and skin, but not so much that hides turn sulky. or sinew yawns. If the steam is too eager, the lining can be lifted by 2 finger widths along one arc, so that the corridor behind it takes some of the eagerness away and hands it to the fire. A good day has this kind of conversation happening without fuss. A small lift here, a small drop there. The room always young in the lungs. There is geometry behind the calm. The cone gathers heat upward. The lining gathers coolness downward. The flaps make a gate. Between them, a stable buoyancy has kept hot air rising in a modest column, pulling soft cool behind the ozan like a tide that never slaps. Take away the lining, and the tide becomes an argument. Smoke folds back on itself, cheeks tingle with needles, and the fire wastes its breath on spectacle. With the lining, the hearth can be small, the stones can do their long work, and the circle can sleep without waking to reprimand the air. Maintenance is housekeeping and physics at once. The hem's stones are checked as regularly as infants' feet are tucked back under robe. Stitching along the hanging loops is watched for fret where it rubs the poles. In real coal, a thin rime may kiss the outer cover down its shadowed side. The lining keeps that kiss from traveling to mouths if the rime grows noisy on the outside. Someone will take a stick and comb the cover from the windward side so that the ice falls in little sighs and does not burden the poles with too many arguments at once. The ozan inside hangs calm. You can knock your knuckles against its weight and hear the thud of steadiness. When camps move, the lining packs last and is set first, as if the lodge were being taught its manners before being given its voice. A girl in her first winter of helping learns to sling the panels over her shoulder, the tiny stones printing their round logic against her back. She will, by spring, be able to hang the ozan in near dark, placing the loops by touch, counting pole spaces like rosary beads, knowing when the hem's run has gone true by the way the air behind it stops fidgeting. There are evenings when wind changes twice before the stories have turned once around the circle. The lining allows such fickleness to be a topic rather than a trial. A small shift of flaps, a correction at the hem, and the smoke resumes its modest braid. Even cooking can be adjusted without panic. The pot is moved to the hearth's lee so that its steam joins the draft rather than picking fights. You will sometimes see the woman lay her hand at shoulder height and hold it there, eyes half closed. She is drawing a map in invisible lines, where cool moves, where warmth pools, where a child's breath emerges as a little cloud and vanishes without complaint. If the map is wrong, she changes it. That is all. Not every family hangs the ozan the same way. Some drop it nearly to the floor in deep winter, letting only a finger of light show between hem and ground. Others like a hand's breadth in most weather, believing that the corridor's long walk tames cold more reliably than a tight seal that pushes it to mischief elsewhere. A few keep a separate small curtain behind the door, a door ozan, to catch the gusts that gossip at the threshold. When people come and go often, the point is not to argue doctrine. It is to behave as if air had a personality and needed good company. Occasionally, canvas panels join a hide cover, or the reverse. The lining negotiates the marriage. Canvas breathes differently, sulks when soaked, flirts with sparks in a new dialect. Hide recalls fire's grammar better, but remembers rain as a series of old arguments. The ozan between them is bilingual. It accepts canvas's quick temper and hides deep memory and asks both to do their jobs with courtesy. You can hear when the negotiation has succeeded. The draft resumes its thread, and voices in the lodge drop by a note without anyone telling them to. Late in the day, when the sun lowers its blade, and the world's pressure shifts with it, the ozan earns its night name. It turns the lodge into a chest with ribs and breath. Outside, cold makes its case. Inside, the lining hears it, translates it, and hands it toward the fire as a work rather than insult. Stones are set near feet. Ash draws its thin blanket. The flaps bow their evening heads. The hem's little stones keep a clean line between world and room. A child pushes a heel against that line in sleep and learns nothing dramatic, only that the boundary is soft on their side and obedient on the other. And if you sit with your back to the ozan at bedtime, you can feel both winters at once, the one that argues, a palm's thickness away, and the one that accepts negotiation. Right here among breath and hide and ember, the lining is not a wall. It is a teacher. It does not punish air. It tutors it. Because of it, warmth belongs to everyone in the circle, elders and infants. The dog by the door, The arrow maker with his thumb like a flattened coin. The woman with the pole hand that reads pressure like script. Because of it, night becomes less a siege and more a conversation that ends, as the best ones do, with quiet agreement. Fuel is not a heat, it is a palette, and winter is the critic. On these plains, the first color most days is not wood, but what the herds gave and left chips shaped by weather into clean, dry loaves of grass, remembered. You can carry a sack of them longer than you can carry pride. They are light, stack well, and when they are right, they do not broadcast their smoke as insult, but as a narrow ribbon that minds its manners. Choosing them is a craft the hand learns before the mind explains. The best chips wear a mat that suggests old sun, not recent rain. Tap two together. Good ones ring with a dry, hollow confidence. Poor ones thud or crumble to dusty confession. Edges should be crisp. A fingernail should meet resistance like thin wood, not spun. A scent rises if you warm one in your palm. Clean prairie, no sore memory. Where herds grazed mixed grasses, chips burned steady. Where feed was thin or green, too late, they may hiss. None of this is a rule. It is a weather report from the hand. Wood is a rarer luxury and a different teacher. Cottonwood, when found seasoned and sky-dried along a bend, makes a coal with spine char that holds and gives, char that lengthens the time between tending. Willow, cut in season and dried honest, is quick to start a chip and courteous in its smoke. There is driftwood from storm water that polished it pale. There is deadfall that has learned humility. None is wasted, none is burned for spectacle. A big flame is a liar in this climate. It promises warmth and delivers smoke and thirst. The lodge wants small, repeatable truths. A day's ledger might look like this. Chips for the ongoing work. Slender willow twigs to catch in the first minute. A slice of cottonwood coin to lay aside and let it find its coal slowly. While chips do their steady talk, you do not bury the coal under impatience. You seat it where draft will pass and encourage it to make the ash shelf a bank with credit. You place chips in a hinge, not a pile. They need spaces between them. Like people in a circle need breath. They do not ask for much air. They ask for reliable air. The lining and flaps, tuned. Give them that. Smell tells you more than sight. Sight sees flame and is easily pleased. Smell reads the contract. A clean burn carries a sweetness of dried grass and a minor, almost nutty note. If you smell sharpness, biting and thin, a chip is wet or too new. It is being scolded into burning and will retaliate with smoke. A small lift of the ash. A nudge to move a sulking chip nearer a confiding coal. A breath with the lips round. Not a gust will correct it. Some afternoon, a stranger visiting will cheer when the flame leaps. The one tending smiles and trims the leap down to a conversation. Stones make the difference between appetite and diet. A lodge that runs solely on flame wastes its own work. Heat stored in rock river polished. Tight grain. Tested for seams by cautious heating turns a small fire into an evening. The stones sit in the hearth as if indifferent until midnight, when they reveal their patience. To charge them, a chip-heavy hour is best. A modest flame that kisses the stones, not a tantrum that chases smoke back into the room. When a stone complains, tiny tick, a warning of steam imprisoned back on. Better a slow heat than a shiver crack and a memory of broken grit underfoot. On hard weather days, the fuel plan changes shape, but not philosophy. Snow blurs. Wind sharpens. The draft will urge you to overfeed in fear. Resist the impulse to make a bonfire inside a cone. Instead, shorten the interval between small offerings. A pair of chips more often is better than a handful all at once. The flaps narrow, but never into panic. There must be a path. The ash shelf is pulled forward to blanket the hottest red, so the burn is long, not loud. Somewhere in this, a child will ask why the fire is so small when the storm is so big, and you will answer the teaching that winter itself taught. Small fires travel farther through the night. Fuel is also a walk in the afternoon with baskets and calm eye. Children learn routes that are really systems along the lee of a long sage. Chips collect in drifts. At the outer curve of a frozen bend, pale sticks speak of water's temper. They test, discard, keep. They carry home more judgment than weight. In camps nearer woodland, a different logic applies. Split a dead limb to find its dry heart. Shave kindling that curls like thin tongues. Keep bark for the one moment at dawn, when you ask for the fire's voice to be a touch louder to wake coals with respect. The rule survives the change. Trade show for stamina, a moment for caution. Spoken the way elders speak, cautions without theater and therefore unforgettable. Never heat unknown stones to fury. Some hold water as a secret and will open themselves suddenly with a report that startles infants and injures those who trusted them too quickly. Test by proximity first, by patient warmth, by a small spit that should dance and vanish, not hammer and hiss. Do not feed chips that have known the recent rain unless the hunger is for smoke. Do not use green willow when that willow might have been a new mat in spring. Do not let the ash pile grow arrogant. Lift it and redistribute so coals can breathe. Do not confuse brightness for heat. A blue whisper can warm a lodge better than a yellow shout. The pot belongs in the fuel conversation. A simmering stew on the lee edge steals waste heat and returns moisture to the air where winter tries to take it. Too close and it bosses the draft. Move to thumb's width out. It becomes a partner. Grease fed back to the pot. Spares sparks in the hearth and spares throats the scratch that dry air invents. The cook is therefore a kind of firekeeper, and the firekeeper a kind of cook. Both know that the lodge breathes easier when warmth comes from many small acts that agree with one another, rather than from one large act that tries to do too much. There are experiments that wander through camps and seasons. A ring of small stones set beyond the hearth to warm a second circle of feet. A flat river rock used as a trivet to keep a pot obedient. A chip grated larger and laid in early evening to anticipate the hour when conversation thins. Once, during a run of bitter nights, someone tried building a higher cone of chips to see if a taller flame would make quicker sense of the cold. It did not. Smoke became a bully. Eyes felt old by midnight. The note on that winter's ledger was brief and has been kept. Short flame, long stone. Fuel philosophies are also about fairness. Heat belongs to the whole lodge, or it does not deserve the name. Chips carried by children become stones at elders' feet. Cottonwood coins saved on a short day become a long hour for a recovering cough. The fire is placed not to flatter the cook alone, nor to please the one who fears dawn's chill, but to serve the circle's map. When someone returns with arms full, a hand from the circle takes the load and lays it near the door to let the cold leak out of it before it meets the hearth. Another small agreement between materials and lungs. In the late afternoon light thin, metallic, honest, the par flesh of chips waits by the threshold like a quiet friend. A boy reaches in blind, by feel alone, chooses 3. This is what apprenticeship looks like when it has ripened. The fingers know the grammar. The wrist writes the sentence. The fire nod. A single willow sliver makes a bridge, a breath. Shaped in kind, crosses it. The lodge answers with its steady composure. Outside, the day goes dull. And then pearl, inside, the ledger balances. Chips to ember, ember to stone, stone to foot, foot to sleep. No line is in red. Nothing is owed that cannot be paid by the next small act. When night settles its heavier hand, the hinge of chips is set. The cottonwood coin whispers its longer promise. Ash is drawn like a thin blanket, and stones are placed on their slow orbits. The flaps bow into their night angle. The lining listens to the first cold of evening and tames it. The pot breathes, and in the hush that follows, the fuel no pile at all, but a plan becomes a kind of music. The room can sleep inside. Stones begin as river grammar, rounded by miles of persuading water, carrying in their bodies the quiet memory of pressure and time. In winter, they are the lodge's slow heart. You do not heat stones because you love novelty. You heat stones because a small flame cannot do every job at once, and because warmth that glows without flame is a mercy. The night never argues with it. Selection is a walk more than a lecture. In the good seasons, people scout bars along bends where floodwater forgot its pockets. Ovals and lozenges that fit a palm, smooth as if language had worn all the sharp from them. There are rules, offered without trumpets. Avoid the rock that shrugs into powder at the nail. It has no patience. Avoid the stone whose skin is pocked like bread. Too many pores, too much room for a secret of water to hide and rage. Prefer the pieces that answer a tap with a dignified thud, not a tinny chatter. Quartzite, granite, the dense cousins of the sandstone family. Each valley has its favorites, each family its loyalties. A test is always made, and is ceremonial in the way tying a shoe is ceremonial, a habit with meaning. First proximity, nestle the candidate in the fire's neighborhood, not its mouth. Let heat travel inward on soft feet. Watch for the small betraying tick that says steam is trying to escape too fast through a seam. If it does not complain, invite it closer. Then the spit test, a finger dampen, a whisper of moisture touched to the stone. If it dances and vanishes, the heat is true. If it hammers and snarls, the heat is reckless. The stone does not need to prove anything. You teach it to hold a season, not an instant. In the lodge, the hearth is arranged to make a gallery for stones as they learn their work. A long, low piece sits as a bench for the pot. The rounders take the nearer heat so that they drink slowly. In the hour between dusk and the first story, a cadence. Chip, chip, willow sliver, ash drawn up. A cottonwood coin resting where it can grow a spine of coal. Meanwhile, the stones draw the evening in. A woman turns one with a forked stick. The stick burnished near the notch from 100 nights of this same small priesthood, and feels the mass answer under the tool. Warmth climbs into her wrists, as if to reassure her that it has business beyond spectacle. Wrapped stones are not simply placed. They are appointed. A pouch of thick hide, shaved thin on the inside, where contact will be. Left stout without receives the stone. A tie secures it, so there will be no wandering in the dark. By the elder's feet, the pouch becomes a sunrise that never blinds. By the infant's bedding, it is a settled animal that has come to share its sleep. Stones laid under robes at the calf teach blood to move without urgency. Stones slid near the hands of a woman who has scraped and stitched all day. Let the ache think kinder thoughts. There is choreography in the timing. A stone too early is an argument. Too late, and it is a kindness wasted on hours already endured. The firekeeper uses the language of ash and draft to schedule the lodge's meteors. One goes to charge, while another gives back. One moves to the hearth's cool edge to hold what it has without climbing into insult. A new recruit is introduced by degrees. If you watch the orbit from dusk to midnight, you would see a deliberate sky, a planet circling near the sun, another at aphelion making its slow promise, a third crossing the lane to become useful, where a child's heel will inevitably escape the rope. Caution rides alongside comfort and never raises its voice. Nobody heats a stone they do not trust, and trust is built in daylight. In summer, in the idle minutes by water when hands learn the difference between grains and seams. If a stone starts to tip, its pride is cooled with ash and distance. If one misbehaves with a hot spit, it is not shame, only reassigned to the pot's trivet duty or the outer ring where feet rest against firm, unheated patience. Stones have career. A cracked veteran may still make a fine door weight on a gusty day. No one forces a task that invites breakage. The lodge is not a factory, wrapped and in place. A stone changes the conversation of the room. Now the fire can be trimmed to ember, its breath divided between keeping coals honest and feeding stones their appointment hours. Smoke grows more obedient when flames stop showing off. The draft likes a hearth composed of orange thought instead of yellow speech. Breathers in the circle feel a secret. Warmth does not need to be seen to be owned. People turn in under hide, knowing that heat is working nearby, like a friend who said, "Sleep, I'll sit up a while." There is a sound to a good stone's evening, not much, only the hiss when a stray flake of snow finds it at the door. The faintest click of hide stiffening as the pouch cools toward morning. A sigh when a foot meets it and stops searching. A grandmother's face loosens around the eye. A child, who kicked free like a colt an hour before, drapes a heel over the pouch and cannonballs deeper into dream. The dog by the door takes the edge of the warmth and lends back a tail's worth of heat in exchange. The trade is elegant and entirely without ledger. In storm runs that last more than one night, stones become the lodge's savings account. When wood is cautious and chips are low, when wind bullies the flaps into their narrowest sermon, stones hold what fire made earlier and distribute it across the dark. A rotation schedule emerges so naturally that a stranger would mistake it for magic. This one for the elder's knees until first waking. That one to the mother's feet until the child forgets to seek. The third held in reserve near the par of flesh so that the hour before dawn, when cold is clever and bold, can be answered with quiet generosity. The fire's visible work shrinks, the stone's invisible work grows, and the room never becomes a museum of breath. In the morning, there is a courtesy. Stones are not left anywhere to cool with resentment. They are gathered, unwrapped, tested with a palm for any hairline sulk that the night might have written across them. If a line is found, the stone retires with thanks to lower ambitions. If it remains whole, it goes back to the hearth's apprenticeship, learning another day's charge. Hide pouches are turned inside out and air. The faint sweetness of warmed leather and old smoke saying what it always says, "This house remembers you." Some seasons bring experiment. A flat stone just beyond the hearth becomes a modest bench for thawing boots, the warmth traveling through leather into sole, sparing the feet the first bite. A line of smaller pebbles is arranged along the outer arc to make a mild climate line for the young, who insist they are never cold. The pebbles do almost nothing, and yet the children swear by them, because belief has a thermal component. Someone places a stone under the mat near the door to keep the lacing fingers honest at dawn. Each test is kept if it behaves, and forgotten if it crowds the room's larger agreement. Water meets stone with tact. A pot lifted and set upon a warmed flat becomes a simmer without scolding, a way to continue a broth's thinking after the flame has been asked to whisper. When the pot is too close and steals draft, the stone trivet moves a thumb width and harmony returns. When a visitor asks why there is no rack of iron, the answer is a grin and a nod toward the river. We prefer to carry our racks one stone at a time. Children learn to carry stones the way they learn to carry stories, both hands. Good posture, looking where they will set them down. They are told the names of places where the best stones were found, and those names stick as if glue. The reach, the bend, with the yellow root. Foxes crossing. To know which bar has the honest rocks is to have a map of patience written in your legs. A child who has warmed their palms over a wrapped stone in a blizzard will grow into an adult who sets that stone by an elder's feet without anyone telling them to. Skills travel in bodies like that. If the camp move, stones travel too. They are not dead weight. They are family. A bundle of them rides on a travois, tucked in sack. Their mass balanced by experience so that the pull is work and not harm. When the new site is chosen, a bench that takes sun early, a shoulder out of the inversion's throat. The stones are the first to greet the new hearth's dirt. They go down like old friends sitting where they sat the last time the circle was drawn. Even the first small fire shows relief at seeing them. It can be small and sure, because its future has already been stored. Late one night, in a break between two rants of wind, the old man wakes and reaches a foot forward. The pouch answers. He remembers in a sleep-torn way the young days when he thought only flames could win an argument with January. He smiles into his robe and decides that he will teach his grandson in spring to choose stones by ear. The thought itself is warm. Across the lodge, the woman who has learned the flap's dialect sleeps with her hand near the crossed poles. If the wind shifts, her wrist will wake before her eye. Between these two competencies, the stones do their long patient job, which is not to be impressive, only reliable. By dawn, the stones are not cold, just returned. They become gray planets again, in a small sky of ash. The first riser turns one with a stick and feels last night's promise as a residuum in the palm. The room is not cruel. It is simply morning. Fuel will resume its hinge. Breath will resume its slow arithmetic. The flaps will uncross their arms, and the stones will be invited, once more, to remember the day in a way that can be spent at midnight without death. It is a simple contract and an ancient one. Carry this for me, and I will carry you. In such trade, warmth becomes a citizen of the lodge rather than a guest. Before a lodge ever breathes, the ground must agree to host a winter. Sight is not a backdrop. It is the first ally or the first problem. People who sleep well in hard weather learn to read land as if it were a shallow river turned to stone. Its currents invisible, but everywhere felt cold. Given a slope and a dark hour, flows the way water flows down into hollow, pooling in the bottom, curling behind obstacles, seeking stillness where the sun is slow to arrive. Warmth begins with refusing the places where cold collects its thoughts. So a bench is chosen, not the valley's floor, a shoulder dressed in grass above the creek. South-facing if it can be had. Southeast if mornings come hard. A place with modest drainage, where Thaw will not turn the door into an argument. The old ones stand in silence and study. They feel the forearm wind, the way it leans off the ridgeline at dusk. The tug in the cheekbones that says a night breeze will slide along the creek and make mischief. The faintness in the ears that comes when a hollow hoards chill. They do not use the word inversion, but they know it with the intimacy of lungs. Cold air is heavy and ambitious. It wants to settle and make law. You do not camp where cold is king. Windbreaks are courtesy, not wall. A long willow thicket, a cut bank, a line of old snow fence of your own making, with brush and drifted grass. These are better than a cliff that will turn gusts into lashes. You stand on the chosen spot and look outward for what will argue with the smoke flap, what will kick back eddies into the door at dusk. A single boulder upwind can make a small weather you do not want. A lone cottonwood can gossip cold down its trunk into the tent of air. The best places look untroubled, nothing tall enough to throw tantrum, nothing so low that night's breath will sulk and sit. Sun is a map you trace with eyebrows and patience. In deep winter, the arc is shallow and the blade of light slides under your hand as if apologizing. You want that blade to arrive early enough that ice on the hides loosens its hold with a sigh rather than a crack. South-facing benches give that courtesy. The cone of the lod, warmed a finger's worth at dawn, behaves better all day. Cover relaxes. Seams forgive. The door laces without stiff resistance. You waste fewer minutes persuading materials that apathy is not a virtue. Between lodges, spacing is a polite geometry. Not too near the eddies from one smoke braid can bully another into sulking. But not so far apart that snow makes each visit a pilgrimage. Doors tend to face a common sense, often away from the season's principal teeth, and the alleys between invite wind to behave as a road rather than a prank. Paths to water keep to the sun where possible, so that the day does not spend its small heat melting the same boot prints again and again. Where animals pass, you leave them their lanes. A herd that must invent new paths will spend its days inventing new arguments with your camp. The ground itself speaks in texture. Sandy loam drains with manners. Clay holds grudges. A crust of grass roots stitched into earth keeps mats clean and Thaw honest. If you must choose snow for a night's floor in a run of storm, you will stamp it hard and let it set before bringing a lodge down upon it. An ice bed that will not collapse into surprises at midnight. The first time a child feels the give of snow that was not set, they learn the lesson without scolding. There is weather you plan for, and weather that arrives as a rumor and stays. When a storm line bruises the western rim in late afternoon, a camp on a bench feels it first in the flap's grammar, not in the door seam's elbows. A good site allows choice. Doors can narrow without panic. Flaps can be strong without shouting, and the draft can keep its promise in a wind that has forgotten diplomacy. In a bottom, that same storm would sit on you, flatten the smoke bray, and turn chips into a salt. Trees are not always a kindness. A stand will solve one problem and invent three. Snow loads branches. Branches decide when to shrug. A night full of thumps that are not the hearth's shy sigh will age an elder's sleep. Saplings wick cold up their columns and drip it into the immediate air like slow poison. Yet a row of willow cut low, a bristled hedge of brush, can turn a long fetch into a broken fetch. Less fetch means less grievance in the wind. People here learn to build their own tree lines out of what the valley gives and what the valley will take back without grudge when spring speaks. All of this bench aspect, braid, spacing. Floor is a program that makes the fire smaller and the night easier. The physics has a human face. Elders placed where dawn will reach them first. Infants near the softest radiance. The door is set where morning's lane will not fight adrift. A cook's path that does not cross the firekeepers. A place outside for boots to be scolded of their snow before they are forgiven into the room. Even dogs have their corners where a warm leak from a stone will find a tail and make it thump once. Content. You can see the microclimate in winter's handwriting. Frost draws heavier ferns on the cover's leeward side. Rime feathers the low edge in the shadow of a brush windbreak. Snow sculpts a skirt that, if managed, becomes insulation instead of trap. A woman with a stick will walk the windward side and comb the cover downward, persuading the ice to fall in quiet slips rather than sit and add weight by conspiracy. The poles answer the unloading with a pleased creak. The cone regains its voice. If the bench is right, the skirt draws back from the door enough that dawn does not begin with a dig. You could prove this with instruments. A pot of ash set out at dusk in the hollow will glaze hard by morning, while the same pot on the bench will remember a softer night. A breath at the threshold will bite sharper in the bottom than under the ridge. In a world that likes picture, someone with a modern eye would come one day with a camera that sees temperature as color and show what the old ones already know. Blue cold pooling like water in the bottoms, warmer shades on the benches where air, loose to move, forgets to be cruel. The image would look like a map of rivers that learn to flow without water. Paths during a cold snap are laid where land lends help, across a swale. You do not cross the deepest center. You skirt the shoulder that kept its sun to water. You descend by the gentlest ribs so your breath remains in your chest rather than on your teeth. Coming back, you climb where the wind at your back is not a bully. When you bring chips home, you set them down just inside the door to let their cold leak into the corridor behind the lining before they meet the hearth. The sight is still doing work even after you stop walking. Its choice continues to pay. There are cautions taught without drama. Do not camp in the first pretty meadow the valley offers you. Valleys are salesmen. Walk a little longer. Listen for the muted sound your boot makes on ground that drains and the different word it uses on ground that slicks. Do not let a cliff lend you its shadow at noon. It will want its strength back at dusk and will take it from your breath. Do not sleep where an old flood wrote its high line into bark. Rivers are excellent historians and occasionally nostalgic. Do not trust last winter's success, but if the wind has changed composers this year. Pressure remembers different songs after long summers. Once the site is chosen and the circle is set, gratitude becomes maintenance. Snow, managed, becomes a skirt that hugs the cover's lower edge and serves as a kind of willing insulation. A path to the privy is kept broom smooth, not because appearance matters, but because a smooth path does not trip a robe or steal heat with clumsy delays. The trash of chips. The dust that collects where they are shaken finds a life as anti-slip on a slick step. The shelter for wood or chips sits where it borrows heat from the lodge's wall without stealing draft, a lean-to of discretion. When you step back from a well-chosen camp, you can feel a paradox. It looks as if it simply happened there, the way a nest seems always to have been at that fork of branch, and yet you know it is the sum of 100 seeing acts. In storm, the lodges hunker but do not cower. In sun, they loosen without slouching. Smoke rises in braids that do not insult each other. The creek goes its way and does not inhale the camp's breath. A bench that receives light early makes a music of thaw you can hear under your boots. At night, when the wind has threatened to exchange your careful day for its own plan, the bench keeps its promise. Cold flows past in the hollows like slow water under ice. Up here, the lodge remains a modest star with its own weather, its doors slit breathing, its lining listening, its stones remembering. Morning will find frost writing its delicate script where you expected it and not where you don't. The first hand at the flaps will feel the smallest approval on the cheek, a pressure that says, you placed your house on the right side of a valley's thought. And so the ground itself becomes part of the warmth, not because it is generous land, is not a personality, but because you asked it the right questions and believed its answers. A south shoulder, a steady breeze that knows how to leave a room, a floor that drains, space enough that every lodge can keep its own draft without teaching its neighbor bad habits. In such places, even the hardest weather arrives as a challenge you have already begun solving, long before the first chip hisses or the first stone is turned. Archaeology meets warmth the way winter meets breath, by inference. The lodge that made nights merciful leaves almost nothing that wants to talk a century later. Hide returns to soil. Sinew follows it. Poles become shadows in the dirt if they confess at all. What remains is what the fire touched and what the wind could not carry. A darkened lens of ash braided with charcoal. A ring where stones once disciplined the cone's hem. A scatter of reddened, crazed rock where water inside pebbles learned the sudden language of steam. From these careful hands try to reconstruct not only a house, but a climate. A field note might read, on paper gone crisp as Locality 12B, bench above East Fort. Ring indistinct on south quadrant, accentuated north. Interior discoloration 1. Tooth shut across oxidized soil. Magnetic response elevated. Char fragments fine. Dominated by willow cottonwood taxa tentative. Below. A pencil drawing. A circle not quite circle. A darker patch like a coin pressed shallow into earth. A few small stones clustered where the wind would have come hardest. On a separate line, a modest guess. Door likely southeast. Flaps might have favored west wind. Then, in a different hand, some years later, a cautious addendum, or the ring is an old corral, and the stain a cook fire, unrelated to habitation. Honest work admits several doors. Stone rings get all the credit because they stay. Yet, even stone rings are unreliable, historian. People moved rocks to mow, to sit, to make children's games. A winter's snow can slouch a ring downslope. A spring flood can edit the edges. Some families weighted hems with bags of earth or with ice skirts, encouraged to freeze in place. No stones at all. Some rings are doubled, inner and outer, hinting at a heavier cover or a season with a mind for gale. Others are so faint you feel them with the shin before you can prove them with the eye. Archaeologists learn to walk circles with their knees. What the fire leaves is more articulate. Heat alters soil the way years alter. Voices a deepening, a faint iron sweetness. Magnetic susceptibility rises where repeated hearths taught minerals to hold a small memory of flame. A lens of ash holds its line beyond one storm's cooking. Charcoal, sieved and coaxed under glass, can be asked to name its trees softly. Willow and cottonwood are modest signatures along a creek. On uplands, a different grammar appears sage, greasewood, the shrugs of short trees that agreed to be fuel. Yet even here, humility helps. A camp could borrow wood from far. A flood could leave a cottonwood heart, where no cottonwood grows now. Evidence travel. In some circle, stones within the ring tell a second story, not a grand one. Just a line of fire-cracked rock inside the living radius, often nearer where elders might have rested. These are stones that live two careers, first as river grammar, then as slow hearts. When they crack, they lie about their past, in the way all broken things do with shiny faces, with a sudden angularity and in a place built from rounds. Their presence does not prove wrapped pouches and sleeping feet, but it makes the picture more likely. A careful worker notes them, sketches their scatter, resists the urge to draw a child's heel nearby in the margin. Post holes are a rumor. Usually, poles were lifted, not left. If a storm forced a lash down, a stake may have kissed dirt hard enough to leave a cone of darker soil or a seam of disturbed texture. More often, the only verticals you can prove are ghosted by small stains where lacing path, or by nothing at all. Ethnographers' words, recorded decades ago, step in to fill that silence. But they are to be used in soft voices and never as cudgels. One valley's habit of 9 poles is not another valley's promise. The lining that one nation called by this name was another nation's different machine under a different word. Archaeology, at its best, lets many lodges stand. There are days when the field becomes a classroom of doubt with a good teacher. A graduate student, face burned brown by a summer of patience, kneels at the edge of a hearth stain and lifts a thin bag of soy, dark as tea. She will float it later, coax out seed, charcoal, the small biographies that gather in ash. The supervisor reminds her not to love the story yet. Let the dirt date itself, he said, and she smiles because the admonition has become funny after the 30th repetition. In the log, she writes what can be borne: radius, depth, context, relation to slope, proximity to an old cut bank that might have wandered. In the evening, she will write a different entry in a pocket notebook she does not hand in. When I press my palm to the stain, I swear it remembers. A winter camp is a poor archivist of its best ideas. The lining that made lungs courteous becomes nothing. The door's lacing dries into rumor. The flap angle wisdom leaves with the hands that held the poles. What survives are negative spaces. The absence of soot where a lining once formed a horizon. The sooting above a certain height that suggests the air below ran young and clear. If the cover skirted snow up against itself and let it freeze into helpfulness, perhaps a shallow trough at the ring's outer edge will tell that story for a year or two. Mostly, though, the best inventions are like manners, felt when present, missed when absent, hard to photograph after. So experimental camps step in to translate. People build again, with hides when they can, or with canvas that admits its different accent. They hang linings, move flaps in measured increment, lay small fire, place stones, recruit winter to be honest, and then take notes with thermometers and cheeks. They watch smoke braids, chart buoyancies, log how quickly a wrapped stone abandons its charge. They do not pretend to recreate a vanished century. They ask the air the same questions and see how it chooses to answer now. Results are ranges, not commandment. A lining lowered to a hand's breadth makes the smoke find sky more readily. A door slit narrowed beyond courtesy steals breath. Chips in a hinge, not a pile, lengthen ember life by a third day's watt. These are not laws. They are good habits rediscovered. Sometimes, too, the land assists in unexpected ways. A winter storm scours snow off a bench and reveals the faint ring of last year's test lodge, remade in light. The oxidized hearth shows itself in a color shift so shy it requires squinting to see. Someone with a camera that sees heat comes on a bitter morning and points it at the ground. The hollows red as old, pooled blues. The bench shows warmer, like a promise. Later, in the report, a single sentence smiles without smirking. Local place names that reference frost pockets show consonants with measured inversions. The old tongues were instruments. There are competing readings, and they are healthy. One scholar sees in the asymmetry of a ring the fingerprint of prevailing winds and door placement. Another sees livestock containment in a later season. A third notes that a 19th century freight route passed within sight and asks whether travelers with canvas made their own patterns that mimic older ones. The archive expands to include journals where the weather was the main character, sketches where a lodge is drawn as if from memory, trading post ledgers listing sinew and awls as if warmth could be itemized. No single line clinches it. The circle remains hospitable to more than one truth. The most honest moments in the literature have a sentence like, "We hypothesize but cannot insist." Also, organic architectures were designed to leave little trace, and we are therefore reading performance from shadow. This humility does not diminish the story, it clarifies it. The very elegance of the lodge, its commitment to breathing, to letting winter be fed to fire rather than fought, meant that its bones were meant to travel and its skin to return to soil. The best of it was always meant to be portable, perishable, shared in camp. By contrast, nothing is hypothetical. The night either bites or it is gently persuaded. People either cough or they sleep with soft throats. Stones either remember, draft either behaves. Archaeology reaches for these lived verbs with nouns it can keep. Hearth, ring, lens, phytolith, sherd from a pot traded 3 valleys away. A bead that tore loose from a story when a sleeve brushed a latch hole. They are enough to keep the picture honest, and not enough to let it harden into romance. I like to imagine a ledger in 2 hands. On one page, the field note. Feature a oval oxidation, FCR present. Ring parse on the other page. Written earlier in smoke and later in nobody's ink. Bank, the coals thin. 2 chips at midnight. Move stone to child's foot. Lower lining on north when the creek wind thinks it's clever. Thongs doubled if the sky has that iron-tasted dust. Between these pages is the work of 100 winters and a century of careful dirt reading, trying not to lie about them. If the story remains slightly out of reach, it is not because it is shy. It is because it was made to be lived, not kept. And so we accept that the trace will always be lighter than the night it once warmed. We hold char and claim only what char can bear. We build again and listen. We let conflicting readings stand like lodges spaced with courtesy, each with its own draft, none suffocating the other. What the work finally gives back is not a museum of certainty, but a renewed respect for people who learn to turn weather into agreement. The ring on a bench above a creek is a punctuation mark. The sentence it ends is written in braid. There is a rumor that lives under some lodges, a warmth with mud on its boot, not a furnace, not a Roman boast with brick vaults and roaring channel, but something smaller, quieter pockets of earth and stone, arranged so that heat, having done its visible work at the hearth, continues on a second shift below. It is not a doctrine, only a set of hunches that have walked beside camps for a long time. And it must be told with all the caution the ground deserves. Begin with what any winter hand learns. Earth carries memory. A shallow depression under the hearth, lined with river stones and filled and refilled with heat across nights, will hold a temper the way old cast iron does. Some families, so the story's half said, shape the hearth not as a flat plate, but as a bowl with a gentle lip. Ash sifted to make a lid that could be pulled forward at night to blanket coal. The bowl's warmth seeped into the ring of stones beneath, and the soil around them learned to hum at a low note. No smoke, no flame, only a slow radiance, as if the ground had agreed to sing in harmony. Now and then, test pits beneath old hearth stains show a modest surprise, a thin lens of reddened dirt under the visible ash, sometimes with a scatter of cracked pebbles not wide enough to be a fire-cracked dump. You could read that as nothing more than heat traveling downward. An experimental camp can choose to interpret and then build. Lay a sub-ring of stones beneath the main circle. Leave small gaps between them like breaths. Then seat the hearth above so that embers can lean into those stones. And teach them diligence. The result is not dramatic. There is no floor that bakes bread, but toward dawn, when cold grows arrogant, the ground near the hearth gives back a comfort that feels disproportionate to the flame's smallness. A child who crawls closer in sleep meets that hum first at the knees and takes it for kindness, which is the only correct interpretation. From this comes a modest, if then only a model, not a law. If the hearth is a shallow bowl, and if stones beneath it are arranged in a ring with thin seams that allow warm air to enter and leave at leisure, then heat stored below will lengthen the night's calm, provided the ash is managed as a lid and the fire is fed in chips, not insult. If the lining's hem is kept steady and the door slit modest, then the draft will not pull that quiet warmth down into arguments. It will let it rise as a suggestion. If the substones are too large, they hoard heat and scold feet. If too small, they cool without leaving a letter behind. If the soil is clay and sulks when wet, the trick works poorly. If sandy low, it behaves like a messenger who neither forgets nor brag. A different rumor speaks of small channels, no tunnels. Nothing a hand could crawl into, just gutters cut by practice across seasons, where people swept coals aside and, over time, were a gentle run in the dirt from hearth toward the door. Warm air travels where circulation is honest. In a few camps that tried this with intention, a shallow swale no deeper than a thumb led warmth outward and lured cold inward along the floor, keeping the lower air from stagnating. The effect was delicate, easily bullied by a careless flap or a wet bundle flung in the wrong place. But when everything else was tuned, the floor felt tidier in its temperatures, as if the room had taught its own ankles to think. Here, humility is a necessary tool. Elders who had a right to keep their best methods private sometimes turned aside questions about such earthwarming. The way a musician declines to talk about the particular tension on a drum he is tuned for a ceremony. Some knowledge is shared by demonstration or not at all. Some is withheld because words turn elegant habits into crude diagrams that travel badly. And, truthfully, not every valley needed or wanted such measure. A site with south sun and diligent stones and an attentive lining already made a generous night. Why teach the ground to sing when the air was already in tune? Experimental archaeology, honest when it is good, accepts conjecture with a bow. In one winter reconstruction, builders created a hearth with a stone underbowl and a thin spoke of pebbles running a hand's breadth beneath the floor toward the door. Thermometers told a story with all the humility numbers can muster. A 2 to 4 degree grace near the hearth's outer ring toward dawn. A slightly quicker comfort in the first hour after banking. A lesser appetite for chips between midnight and first light. Cheeks agreed. A grandmother's joints confessed less complaint, but the same setup on a different bend, with wind talking through the creek's throat, gave almost nothing back. The numbers shrugged. The cheeks stayed impartial. The report's best lines were the soft one. Underfloor stone arrangements may assist in some contexts. They behave like other parts of the lodge. They ask to be read, not imposed. The analogy to hypocausts is tempting and mostly misleading. Those great floors over roaring fires were architecture as empire. Here the scale is human and the materials local. If there is a likeness, it is in the principle that warmth delivered from below gentles breath and muscle. But the lodge cannot spare the fuel for a furnace, and it has a better idea anyway. Let stones and ash and shallow earth conspire to smolder usefulness rather than dazzle. If the Roman model is a parade, the lodge's is a lullaby. Another small practice belongs in this ledger of ground tricks. Ash is insulation, spread thin and even beneath the hearth's lip. Ash becomes a mattress for embers and a memory palace for heat. Pushed forward at midnight, it softens coals to a long reds, drawn back in the morning. It bears a heart, eager to be fed. Some families collected the previous day's clean ash into a low bag and set it near the door, where its cold could leak into the corridor behind the lining. Then at night, that ash now tempered returned to the hearth as blanket. A circle within a circle. Temperatures circulated with the same courtesy as stories. Cautions should walk beside all this. Dig too deep, and you make a sump that steals comfort and invites damp. Overheat an untrusted stone in a subfloor, and you risk a crack that will pester bare feet for weeks. Where rodents are neighbors, channels become invitations you did not intend to send. And never let the glamour of cleverness steal attention from the flap's dialect or the lining's grammar. An exquisite under hearth cannot clean the air that a sulking flap will foul. If you want a rule, and winters often do, it is this: the lodge is a single instrument. Any new string must be tuned to the rest. Under hearth stones must agree with the fire's size, the ash's veil, the lining's height, the door's manner, the site's posture. A small success is multiplied when it has friends. A cleverness alone, without companions, is merely a noise. What persuades more than numbers is the way such arrangements feel in the body on a hard week. When wind wrote its stern script across canvas and hide, a camp tried the bowl hearth with its sub-ring and carried the experiment in quiet. No speeches, no wager, only watchfulness. Toward dawn, the elder who woke to tend found that her hand read the floor as if someone had left a kindness there. She moved a stone to a child's foot and smiled at doing it with less haste. At breakfast, nobody mentioned the ground, and that silence was the compliment. A comfort that does not announce itself is usually the right size. And yet, we keep the words cautious. Hypothesis. In some contexts, it honors the variety of winters and the sovereignty of valley. The people who held this knowledge had no interest in turning it into geometry that could be exported without injury. They had interest in sleeping well, in sharing warmth fairly, in teaching their children to read air and earth with equal respect. When asked directly, an old woman once said, "Sometimes we make the fire's bed comfortable so it does not fuss." If that's all the archive ever records of subfloor wisdom, it may be enough. So we leave the rumor half told on purpose. We keep experimenting without falling in love with our own cleverness. We write models with if and then, and we hold them lightly. We trust cheeks and lungs as much as instruments. We remember that the lodge's greatest technology is still the part you can see. A small, competent flame, a lining that tutors air, flaps that hear wind, stones that remember, a door laced with intention, a site chosen with humility. If the ground joins in and hums along, so much the better. If not, the song still carries. When people rebuild what once kept nights honest, numbers arrive like shy animals, useful, alert, and quick to flee exaggeration. The first winter, a group set up a canvas lodge in the bones of the old design lining, hung to a seated back. Smoke flaps on poles that could translate thought into angle. Hearth, a shallow bowl. Stones vetted by river logic. They brought thermometers along with cheeks. They promised themselves modesty. No proclamation, only ranges. No hero photograph, only notes written by faces and lung. What emerged across trials was hardly a drum roll, but it was steady, with the lining dropped to a hand's breadth above the floor. And weighted true, smoke climbed faster and stayed in its braid. The air below shoulder height read, younger too. Sometimes as much as 5 degrees of grace, compared with the same shell without a lining. The exact favor depending on wind's personality that hour. Draft at ankle level softened from sharp to useful. Coughs recorded without melodrum. Quieted when the lining was raised too high in optimism. The numbers scolded and the room remembered how to be petty. Lesson. The corridor behind the ozan does the lot of work. Keep it honest. Flaps in small increments did more than grand gestures. A quarter hand's turn of the pole changed everything. A full hand's swing bullied the draft into sulking. When gusts arrived as questions rather than lectures, a listener's wrist could keep the smoke in the thin, quick braid that meant lungs would be fresh in the morning. Delay punished on a night when the watcher drowsed and let 2 gusts pass without answering. Smoke folded back once, twice, and eyes reported it with the candor of sand. Moving the angle a breath's breadth restored the braid. Numbers afterward were shy about the difference. Cheeks were not. Lesson on. Flaps are not doors. They are punctuation. Fires wanted to be smaller than pride. A palm-sized ember field. Chips in a hinge, with air between. A cottonwood coin set to find its coal. Ash pulled like a thin blanket. This made warmth that traveled through hours. When a test group fed fear instead of need and built a blaze the size of a story. The lodge coughed. The linings corridor filled with bad behavior, and the thermometers muttered that heated ankle level had gone rude, while head height fumed. When they returned to the quiet arithmetic, 2 chips, patience. Ash like silk, the room forgave them. Lesson hung. Spectacle wastes warmth, moderation multiplies it. Stones lengthened the night in ways numbers could see and hands could bless. A wrapped stone placed at the elder's feet around the hour when people begin to dream. Deeply kept the nearest air. A notch kinder for 2 hours or 3, sometimes 4. If the stone had been taut all evening, and the ash bank was drawn thin and precise, when stones were rushed, heated hard and fast, they split that kindness in half in the first hour and grew sulky. When heated, the slow way chipped flame kissing. Coal telling a long story, their patience was contagious. Lesson. Thermal mass is a savings account. Deposit slowly and withdraw with humor. Under hearth arrangements, when tried, gave gains that were real but shy. A sub-ring of stones beneath the bowl hearth, seams like breaths between them, made numbers in the 1-4-degree range, at the floor's edge, toward dawn on benches that already read as kind, on low ground that held damp. The same stones sulked and returned so little that the notes simply recorded the experiment and the decision not to fall in love with it. Lesson. The ground is a partner when it wants to be. You ask. You don't insist. Fuel philosophies wrote themselves in the margin. Chips in hinge, not heap. Kept the ember's map clear. Willow slivers in first minutes behaved like a patient teacher. Cottonwood coins lengthened memory. Bark, when indulged in a sleepy moment, made drama and then regret. Soot on the ozan's inner face told on excess in a way that couldn't be argued with. Lesson. The fire is a person in the circle. Feed it respectfully. Do not tempt it into boasting. Humidity joined warmth as a co-author of comfort. A pot set just off the flame where simmer sounded like thinking. Not anger lifted the relative humidity enough that throats woke unpunished and hides did not turn mean under fingers. Too close. And the pot bossed the draft, and the numbers scolded again. Moving it a thumb width was sometimes all it took to let both comfort and draft keep their manners. Lesson. Water is part of heat. Steam is part of air. The pot and the flaps should be on speaking terms. 3 operating principles stated as gently as one states. Weather rose from the notebooks after a season. Shape the air before you burn it. The lining's corridor and the flap's timely grammar do more for warmth than any single fuel trick. Cold arriving low and tamed is not an enemy. It is work the fire can use. If smoke stands up straight and leaves without argument, the room below stays young. Trade flame for stored heat, a small, constant ember feeding stones and ash-banked coals makes the night long. Brightness is a poor proxy for comfort. The arithmetic is chips, ember, stone, foot. Not chips, blaze, apology. Answer the wind. Don't challenge it. Flaps set a whisper ahead of pressure changes. Keep the lodge from becoming an echo chamber of gusts. The cheek is an instrument. Use it. The door seam is a vow. Keep it laced with intention, not bravado. Ranges were the only honest way to talk. 2 to 5 degrees kinder at the floor with lining tuned. 3 hours of foot kindness from a properly charged stone. 1/3 longer ember life with hinge placement of chips and ash veiling. When a visiting reader wanted a single number to carry away like a trophy, the builders pointed to the benches. Some give more back than others. Some wines love to argue. Some nights write in a different dialect. The report kept the words often. Tended to, in this valley. Comparisons to modern houses made everyone laugh a little and then think. A sealed room with a roaring stove can be measured quick. Hot near the metal, stale in the corner, dry as a grudge. The lodge with its lining and flaps read milder, less swing. More agreement. No. It does not turn January into June. It turns January into a conversation you can sleep through. One builder, tired and pleased, wrote in his pocket ledger. We didn't conquer cold. We negotiated working hours. One failure taught more than 3 quiet successes. On a night of restless wind, a team grew bored with small corrections and let the flaps sit while they traded story. Smoke licked, then tasted, then hung. The room's lower air grew old. Cheeks reported nettles. One child coughed and sat up. It took only a quarter-hand turn and a breath of ash drawn forward to repair the harm. But the note the next morning was blunt. Hands must listen when faces begin to complain. The principle slid easily into the teaching canon. Vigilant, not heroic. Because numbers like tables and winter likes habits, someone tried to make a chart of settings. Flap angles for west wind, lining height for deep cold, chip intervals for storm. The chart was tidy and insulted the valley by accident. 2 days later, pressure chose a new song, and the chart looked like a stranger's instructions for a different room. The chart was not thrown away. It was amended with a heading. Example, not order. Underneath, a new line was added. Read the day. It quickly became the only line anyone really needed. There were moments of wonder that have no place in data, but belong in a ledger of warmth. At dawn after a 5-day blow, a grandmother put her palm to the floor near the hearth and said, "With no theater," it remembered. In a thaw, when rime crawled down the outer cover and tried to colonize the lower edge, a girl walked the windward side with a stick, combing ice off in sighs. The poles lightened their voices in gratitude. The numbers didn't move, the comfort did. In late evening, when the pot breathed like a sleeping animal and the flaps set their night angle, the draft made a thread sound that everyone in the circle could find if they wanted to and ignore if they preferred sleep. Instruments did not catch that sound. Bodies didn't. By season's end, the report could say true things without pretending to say all things. It could say that a lining hung low and honest, a small and continuous ember, stones charged with patience, flaps responsive to cheek and pressure, a door laced like a vow, and a site chosen with humility together made nights that did not injure. It could say that warmth belonged to the whole lodge, not by sentiment, but by design. It could say that no figure held still long enough to be absolute, and that this was not a failure. It was the point, and it could end, as good winter writing does, with a human sentence. On the last cold morning, the first riser found the coals willing, the corridor behind the lining cool and polite, the pot ready to speak steam, and the stone at the elder's feet, still telling the night's last story. He smiled because he would not need a blaze to begin the day. Only a breath and 3 chips. In the notebook, he wrote the only metric that mattered to him. Woke without a con. It was not rigorous. It was correct. Storms that last a day teach patience. Storms that last 5 teach choreography. This one arrives with the blunt grammar of a long fetch. Wind fattened by miles. Snow sharpened until each flake feels like ground glass on the cheek. The first hour is noisy and proud. By the third, it has settled into its real intention, a pressure that wants to push the cones sideways and make smoke forget the sky. The lodge answers with the humility of things designed to flex. Flaps narrow to a slit that still says, "Please." The lining drops a finger along the north arc. The door is laced until it breathes only through a thread. Nothing is sealed. Everything is persuaded. By evening, snow has learned the lodge's ribs and begun to write against them. Drift by drift, a white script no one inside needs to read closely to understand. A woman takes the outside round with a stick while there is still light, combing the windward face downward, so ice will fall in quiet sheaves rather than glue itself into tyranny. Her gloved hand knocked once on a pole in old conversation. "I'm listening. Hold what you can. We will keep your voice clear." Inside, someone answers without words by easing a wrapped stone to the place where the elder's ankles ache when weather boasts. A storm's first language is insult. The lodge's first reply is kindness. Fuel becomes a ration with manners. Chips are counted by evening, not by minutes. Children are sent to shake dust from the parfleche onto the threshold, scattering grit there keeps boots from slipping in the small, necessary passages to the door. A cottonwood coin is put on early to begin its long apprenticeship toward dawn. Ashes lifted thin and exact to cover the ember field so that heat becomes long thought, not short argument. Even the pot moves to the place where it will accept a simmer without bullying the draft. Its breath visible, not bossy. On the second night, when impulse asks for a blaze to scare weather into retreat, The firekeeper smiles and gives it 3 chips and a story instead. Stories thicken the air almost as helpfully as steam. They are not decorations for hardship. They are procedures for keeping breath gentle. A grandfather tells the version of a winter when the door laces were cut from rawhide too green and stretched themselves into comedy. The punchline is a child's face waking with frost on the lip because the seam would not accept its duty. Laughter is not wise. Exactly. But it is warm. A mother remembers the storm. When 2 lodges traded stones at midnight, a quiet relay with hoods up, faces covered, only the wrapped warmth passing from one door to the next like a message. The children lean closer to hear which lodges, which doors, and learn without being told how heat belongs to the whole camp first and any single circle second. On the 3rd day, the wind changes key, but not argument. Flaps need more frequent attending. Cheeks begin to sting in the places where the draft wants to test the lining's honesty. The woman with the pole hand adjusts by breaths, not inches. A quarter hand's tilt gives smoke back its braid. A thumb's turn rescues a cough before it decides to speak. She teaches by letting a teenager stand at her shoulder until his skin can hear the difference between sulk and song. He will not forget that this was learned from the face and not from a chart. He will also not forget the other lesson the storm teaches, that a lodge is at its best when more than one person knows how to listen on behalf of the whole. Food becomes a map of mercy. Pemmican loosens into broth with a patience the room can afford. Marrow is coaxed from bone into a shine that feels like sunshine poured into a winter's spoon. A handful of berries saved for exactly such days puts brightness into the breath as much as into the mouth. The pot's lid sits cocked to let steam slip out like a good rumor. Children are given the job of wiping the inside of the door with a hide so that melt and frost do not conspire into treachery. They accept this as heroic duty because everything in a storm is a little heroic if done kindly. Night inside a long storm becomes a curriculum. The first tending is for fire, the second is for stones, the third is for breath. Checking the corridor behind the lining with a palm to confirm that cold is staying civil. The old man wakes to his usual pact with darkness. He will trade sleep for textures and hears the lodge say yes. The draft is still a thread you can put your ear on. The ash veil is still as even as silk. The door seam does not mutter. He reaches a foot forward, and that small, wrapped to sunrise answers. He thinks of the boy who once wanted blaze, and now wants competence. He thinks of dawn as a pressure that can be anticipated with flap angle and ash rather than as a surprise that punishes. By the 4th day, the drifts have grown ambitious and begun their own architecture at the base of each cone. This is both problem and gift, packed right and kept in check. The snow skirt becomes insulation, a willing wall that stiffens the cover's lower edge and quiets certain mischiefs of wind, left to pile in thoughtless heaps. It will bully the cover, strain lacing, and trap the door. So the day's ritual includes the snow worker's dance. Lift, comb, pat, praise. A girl takes her turn and learns to feel with a stick where the skirt should sit a hand's breadth below the lining's hem. No higher, no lower, she realizes, with a satisfaction that shows in the set of her shoulders, that she is shaping weather now, not merely receiving it. A camp under storm becomes a library of small economy. Footpaths between lodges are tamped after each visit, so they will not demand fresh heat as toll. A little chip dust gives grip where ice would prefer to annoy. The place for boots near the door is warmed by a flat stone, so that the first minutes outside do not steal sensation from the foot and mind alike. The bundle of spare laces for the door sits where a hand can find it without looking. Someone, without asking, places a wrapped stone near the dog's corner, because the dog is the one who will tell the door first if the world requires attention. Heat belongs to everyone with lungs and watchfulness. Not every shift is chore. There is a quiet luxury in such weather, time made wide by the impossibility of travel. Bows are eased with a whisper of fat. A seam that has fretted for weeks is given its full measure of patience and goes to good behavior. A child's toy is repaired and becomes for an hour the center of the room's affection. Names of rivers are rehearsed in order, upstream to down, as if speaking them correctly might keep them from freezing in memory. In the corner, Someone hums the small song used for braiding cordage. It climbs the cone and rests there like a warm bird. Cautions walk through everything, soft-footed. Do not ask the fire to be dramatic today. It will take the chance and then sulk. Do not open the door to the storm's whole opinion. Speak through a slit. Do not let ash pile into pride. Keep it thin so that coals do not forget air. Do not trust a snow skirt you have not combed in the last hour. Do not let the pot bully the draft. Move it a thumb width if it begins to think it is important. Do not leave a stone to cool where a bare heel will later learn it by accident. None of these are threats. They are ways of keeping a conversation warm. On the fifth night, a treaty formed. Wind loses its appetite for totalizing the valley, and the pressure outside speaks in a lower tone. Inside, breath moves in a common meter. The lining hums its quiet song. The flaps hold their night angle with less persuasion. The child who always kicks a heel free does it again and meets the familiar pouch. Sleep deepens, as if that foot had found last summer's sun. In the hush, the firekeeper lifts the ash veil and confirms that morning has already been invoked. Coals willing, chips waiting, cottonwood coin remembering, pot thinking. She turns a stone not because crisis asks, but because generosity enjoys being a step ahead. Dawn after a long storm is not triumph. It is relief that behaves itself. The door unlaces with the creak of leather that kept its promise. Light enters as if it had also been rationed. Outside, the drifts are the new topography shoulders and bowl, a white grammar through which the camp will write its paths. The first riser steps out and looks toward the creek and sees, as expected, that the bottom has kept its blue cold like pooled water, while the bench carries a paler shade. Instruments would love this moment, but cheeks do fine. A pole speaks as snow sighs off it, where the stick combed yesterday, and the cone's voice returns to its usual register. What remains inside is the proof that the design and the community behaved. No one woke punished. No one hoarded the one good stone. No one asked the fire to flatter them into believing in a summer night. The ledger of warmth shows its arithmetic. Hinge-laid chips, disciplined ash, stones taught and share, lining tuned, flaps responsive, door true, snow managed into ally, food placed where steam could be a polite co-author of comfort. The storm wrote its name across the camp for 5 days, and then, bored, moved on. The lodge, which never learned to be bored, kept teaching, and if you carry anything from such a week to the next calm evening, it is not a technique alone. It is a posture. Warmth is not a victory. It is a relationship offered again and again under condition. In this posture, a camp is capable of outlasting weather without pretending to be master of it. The stones will remember. The air will be taught. The door will be laced with intention. The flaps will listen. The lining will speak low. The pot will think. And peoples, who are the real instrument in this orchestra, will keep time with patience until the valley remembers a friendlier song. Heat begins at the hearth. Yes, but it also begins under the tongue. A body that has been fed for winter carries its own small fire. In this camp, food is not spectacle. It is a design choice to keep cheeks pink and breath unpunished, to make the night's arithmetic easier on the coals and on the women who tend them. What sits in sacks and parfleche is as much a part of warmth as the lining's hem and the angle of the flaps. Pemmican is the plainest proof that wisdom can be portable. Dried meat, pounded until it stops arguing with the pestle. Rendered fat folded through like sun stitched into cloth. Choke cherries ground whole so their tartness and their pitted strength travel together. This is a winter's map in a single fist. A slice in the stew pot becomes broth with backbone. A shaving eaten plain under a robe is a promise your blood believes. Fat is not scenery. It is fuel that keeps hour 2 at dawn from feeling like judgment. A child bites and blinks, surprised at the way warmth blooms in the throat and then in the chest. A glow without drama. The old man calls it quiet fire and says no more because his face says the rest. Bones are not thrown, they are persuaded. A long shank is split and the marrow coaxed out warm. A candle you eat. Some evenings the bone goes to the pot and gives itself to the room by degrees until the broth grows rich enough that a mouth feels both forgiven and prepared. Brown bubbles gather at the edge like small, confident eye. A nose leans over the steam, and decides to be patient another hour. Morale is not only a word the heart uses, it is a scent. It lives where meat lets go, where fat returns to the body, where a handful of dried berries from summer becomes a bright stitch in the mouth. Stews sit where they can think, not over the flame where they would boss the draft, but just at the hearth's shoulder so that heat climbs into them as advice rather than command. A pot that simmers politely keeps the room kind in ways you can measure with a palm and with a story. Hands working sinew do not crack. Lips do not become grudges. A cough born of dry air considers itself mistaken and leaves. When the pot grows ambitious, it has moved the smallest width of a thumb and learns its manners again. This is the same grammar the flaps obey. Correction by gentleness, not by drama. Plants carry summer forward, and the winter smiles at how this is not an argument, but an arrangement. Prairie turnips tips and dried in their season. Return to the pot. Like friends remembered, wild onions and their cousins do what onions always do. Make meat honest. Rose hips keep their small sons tucked tight until called upon. A handful dropped into water turns the night into something the tongue can believe in again. Teas brewed from twigs and needles fragrant, resin bright are poured into bowls that warm hands first and then throats. No one gives lectures about vitamin, and yet older mouths nod in systems that know the word by another name. Kindly, fire has its own budget. The food honors it. Meat cut small cooks faster. Stones warmed under the pot carry simmer after the flame has been asked to whisper. A flat river rock set as trivet turns a boil into a long sigh, the way a story turns into sleep. On long storm days, the fuel plan meets the meal plan, and both learn to be patient together. Chips offered in hinge at strict intervals. A cottonwood coin nurturing its coal as if weaning a calf. A stew that refuses to shout. The ledger balances because every line is written with the others in mind. Storage is a winter's second fireplace. Parfleche's rawhide boxes, made precise by women who see geometry where others see hide, keep pemmican dry and honest. Meat hung high in the cold, smoked in an earlier month, returns without sulking when asked. Fat sits in a skin bag that knows the difference between sealed and suffocated. It pours in a ribbon that thickens only when it meets the pot's invitation. Berries dried as quarters or as powders. Each family has its manner, are portioned by a hand that has counted storms and knows that kindness in November is only kindness if it can still be offered in January. None of this is scarcity's theater. It is affection paced across weeks. Meals draw maps of the circle that change with weather. Elders are served first, not because they are emperors, but because their bodies bargain with cold differently. Infants receive heat that was a stone an hour ago, and now is a bowl's worth of steam. Youngers eat later or more thinly on a hard day and feel pride instead of loss. Because the room has taught them since summer that warmth belongs to the whole lodge, or it is not warm. A ladle moves sunwise in quiet ceremony and stops without a word at the person who spent the night listening to the flaps. Gratitude is shallow when it is loud. It goes deeper when it is placed in a bowl. There are foods that feel like specific weathers. A broth thick with bone and a sweet bit of fat is a blizzard's answer. A thin, onion-clear soup on a milder night keeps the draft's youth and the lungs' courtesy without tugging the room into stupor. Porridge made from a grain traded 2 valleys away, tastes of other winters. Its steam carries news, and the old man pretends indifference while taking a second spoon. Even sweets are rationed toward usefulness, a char of choked cherry in a stew to lift the palate after days of sameness. A pemmican bite saved for the hour before dawn, when the courage wears thin. Luxury is not a sin here, it is a measurement. Does it help the room breathe? The body's own rituals join the pots before stepping out. Mouths take a sip. Warmth that lines the throat against air's first cold sentence. On return, hands wrap around a bowl to tell the fingers what the hearth has been doing while they were away. Children are taught to eat slowly, not out of etiquette first, but because fast eating steals heat to feed digestion's sudden fire. Better to pay in steady coins. An elder shows a girl how to pinch a bit of salt between fingers and drop it into the stew for the others. The gesture so small it would be missed if you were not present for a winter's worth of meals. The salt is not a char, it is an agreement. We share the heart. so we season the same pot. Fuel-efficient cooking becomes a sport, the way kindness becomes culture, through repetition that makes pleasure. Someone perfects the one-stick simmer, rotating a sliver of willow the way a clock's minute hand move, so the pot never bullies and never begs. Someone else bets that a stone warmed for an hour will keep a thin stew thinking for 30 minutes after flame has been asked to save its breath. The stone wins and then loses on a colder day, and both outcomes go into the next day's choosing. Innovations that clog the draft are abandoned without sulking. Tricks that make the room calmer are kept and named after the person who made them work. Auntie's two-berry rule, 3-chip broth. Grandfather's half ladle at dawn. Aromas are not decorations. The room's morale can be read in the air's store. Sharp smoke when a chip sulks. A sweetness when marrow gives itself willingly. A wood note when cottonwood coin finally becomes memory on a run of hard night. The women choose a stew that smells like patience rather than like triumph. Triumph is for daylight. Patience is what tucks a child into sleep with a foot warmed by a stone and a stomach holding something that will be heat again at 4 in the morning. Cautions walk here. 2. Gentle and exact. Do not let a pot own the draft. Move it a thumb width before it becomes a broth. Do not scold a lean stew with a blaze. Chips and stones will accomplish what pride cannot. Do not forget water. Thirst is a thief that dresses as tiredness. Do not hoard fat. Spend it in small, steady coins that keep breath young. Do not believe that heat tasted is heat earned. Leave the blaze to the stories and let the bowl do the work. On a night that has insisted all day that it will never end, the meal says otherwise. A bowl is handed to the one who tended the flaps. The spoon moves with a rhythm that matches the draft's thread sound. A sentence passes around the circle that good, said as if tasting the word itself, and the room feels its own temperatures settle into a range that bodies like. Later, when the coals are veiled and the stones are set on their orbits, the pot is edged closer to the hearth, to ghost steep until dawn. It will speak first in the morning. A little steam lifting just as the door unlaces. In that moment you can hear the day's plan. 3 chips, a cottonwood corn, a bowl that plays its part, a breath that does not become a caw. If you try to reduce all this to a rule, it is the same rule the fire keeps, small, steady, shared. A lodge warmed from within by food that knows its work needs less from fuel and gives more to sleep. The circle becomes a body that eats one bowl, breathes one draft, and wakes as if the night had been a long, agreeable conversation rather than an exam. You taste broth and understand the entire system, the lining, the flaps, the stones. The ash has been designing your comfort before you asked. Warmth belongs to everyone in the room, and supper is how it enters the blood with grace. Beds in winter are not furniture, they are microclimates. A sleeping place in the lodge is made on purpose, with the same care as flap angle and ash veil. First, the floor mats of willow that do not hoard damp. Hides laid where grain will lift the body off the ground's memory. On the cool arc, 2 or 3 layers answer the season. Nearer the hearth, 1 thick hide. Hair in lets warmth arrive without argument. A woven robe, buffalo hair, twisted and looped into a dense, springy fabric goes down where joints complain. Pillow, if you want to call them that, are small sacks that know many jobs, stuffed with sweetgrass or cattail fluff in kind weather, with soft scrap and dried chips in hard weather, so they warm themselves just by being touched. Robes are the weather you wear to sleep. A heavy hide, smoked and softened, opens like dusk. Beneath it, lighter pieces nested like seasons, hair in next to the skin where it makes sense. Hair out where sleet wants to be reminded of summer. Children are bundled in the confidence of elders' arms, not only for love, but for physic. 2 bodies make one microclimate that forgives a draft's small mischiefs. Youngers on the outer arc keep a foot's length of distance from the cover, so that the lining's river can do its work without jostling. Where a cough lived, the bed shifts closer to the hearth's modest radiance, and the flaps are tuned to lift smoke by a fraction before it remembers lungs. Moisture is the enemy that pretends to be harmless. Snow is shaken off at the threshold, and then again at the inner door line. Mittens, moccasin, and leggings are hung where they will steam without stealing draft. A cross stick above the hearth is not a rack for boasting, but a quiet bridge for things that need to lose their wet politely. Leather learns bad manners if cooked. It is aired and persuaded, not scalded. In the first minutes after coming in, skin is rubbed briskly, not as ritual, but as heat made from work. The heart does willingly. A small cup of warm broth lines the throat before a bed swallows a body. That sip is equal parts water, fat, and instruction. Night has procedures disguised as kindness. A stone is warmed and wrapped and placed where a heel will eventually find it. The person who places it has learned, through a winter's education, exactly where the sleeper's foot wanders in dream. The ash is drawn into its thin veil so that the ember field does not turn boastful at midnight. The pot is slid a thumb width nearer to leak its small cloud into the room's grammar. The lining's hem is pressed by 3 knuckles along its run to be sure the little wrapped pebbles still sit true. A hem that flirts makes air unfaithful. The door's laces are touched, each in order. The way some people count prayers, not superstition. Assurance that the seam is not asking to be a wind's toy. Clothing in sleep is layered with a logic that keeps skin dry. Wool or plant fiber traded in later times lives next to the body only if it behaves. Otherwise, soft, well-smoked hide is kindest. Boots come off early, so their damp does not become the bed's damp. Foot wraps are changed. A dry inner pair waits rolled inside the robe's fold. Children learn that sleeping in wet pride is foolishness. To be brave is to be dry. Caps or hoods cover ears, not because the room is cruel, but because ears are prima donnas and like to be noticed. A thin head wrap is loyalty to morning's comfort bought cheap. Etiquette has a thermal component. The lane from door to hearth is kept clean, not just for dawn's rekindling, but for night's quiet tending. No bed creeps into that lane. No bundle is allowed to camp there. The outer arc yields a hand's breadth when someone passes with ash stick and 3 chips. The inner arc stills so the draft can keep its sentence unbroken. A cough becomes everyone's business for 1 minute. Flaps shift. Pot exhales. A stone moves, then it goes back to belonging to one body. The dog is given the corner that reads the door and leaks a trickle of warmth from a nearby stone because the dog is the first to tell when weather changes its mind. In that, the dog is part of the instrument, not a pet. Visitors are placed by both courtesy and physics. A cousin from the next valley is given a bed where they can read the room's grammar without suffering from it. Not in the draft's ankle rivet, not so near the hearth that the face forgets manners. When they rise too quickly in the night and reach for the door thong the wrong way, a hand catches theirs in the dark and turns it. Laces loosen downward, not up, so the seam falls against itself. Not open into mischief, later overstew. The lesson is told as a small joke. The joke is a syllabus that prevents tomorrow's cold from being invited in by error. Drying gear becomes part of the circadian. Mittens that worked hard are turned inside out and later righted. Smoke gently etches its memory into their fibers so that the next snow beads and slides rather than colonize it. Moccasin soles are coaxed back to honesty with a wipe of grease. Too much, and they talk back slickly to the packed path. Too little, and they stiffen into complaint. A child is given the task of feeling the cross-stick items for heat and declaring them done, which they do with excessive ceremony. In this camp, chores are rehearsals for a body that will know how to keep itself kind without being told. Health lives in the air as much as in the bowl. The pot's simmer keeps humidity just ahead of winter's theft. Noses wake wet enough to work. Chests open without persuasion when a cough takes root. Its bed moves, its bowl changes, and the flaps answer first small responses before anyone pretends to be a physician. Cedar or sweetgrass smolders at a respectful distance and is understood to be both courtesy and cleanliness. Hands wash in warm water before bed if water can be spared. If not, a warmed cloth and a bit of soap root do their quiet work. Hygiene here is not an imported lecture. It is how sleep wakes as comfort, not grit. Fire safety is a phrase that would not be used, but the practice is perfect. No sparks near door lacing, no fooling with dry fluff over the hearth, no tall flame in a board out. The ash veil is thin but exact. It is lifted with the stick's back, not its forward edge, so prey embers are not scattered into mischief. Children are taught where to be and where not to be by having their wrists gently redirected 100 times. The one time a spark kisses a robe, the lesson happens without drama. The spark is pinched, the robe is aired, the flaps are given a breath more angle. And the tale is told later as a reminder with laughter over it, so it can be remembered without fear. Dawn rituals reverse night rituals without apology. The first riser, often the one whose dreams are shallow by nature, slides out from the robe's mouth without stirring the whole map. 3 chips are waiting because someone last night respected morning. The ash is drawn back to bear the coal's patient heart. A willow sliver bridges, breath crosses, and the ember admits its willingness. The pot is nudged to wake on the edge of thought. Stones that served are unwrapped and thanked by palm alone. If a hairline shine, the stone retires from hot duty and becomes a doorweight or a path stone where slip would rather happen. Robes are shaken once, gently, downwind. Beds are smoothed so evening finds them ready to be a climate again. Seasonal adjustments are social, not secret. As the sun learns a longer arc, the lining lifts a finger over 3 days, not one. As storm season harden, door laces double before a blow, not during it. Hides are turned, so hair answers sleet outward 1 week and inward the next, depending on the sky's appetite. If a traded blanket arrive, it finds its place as a liner or a top layer. Not because it is novel, but because it proved itself in a trial nap. Nothing new outranks anything old without a fair test and a winter behind it. Differences across nations are treated as weather, respected, not arguments to be won. Some keep beds on raised frames in earth lodges, a winter luxury of another architecture. Some sew pockets into robes for stones. Some prefer woven covers, others layered furs. Some sleep with heads to the door, others with feet. A visiting woman shows how her people lash a short curtain behind the door to keep the lodge from sighing out its heat each time a body passes. The idea is tested, accepted on storm days, skipped on soft nights. Knowledge travels like warmth, shared, not hoarded, adapted, not imposed. All of this, the small choreography of sleep and dawn, sits within the same law that governs flaps and lining and stones. Small, steady, shared. Beds are tuned like instruments in an orchestra that has learned one long piece. A robe is a section, a wrapped stone, a low drum, the pot. A woodwind that knows when to breathe. The door, a brass that must never play too loud. The lining, the strings beneath everything, the flaps. The conductor's hand, people who have always been the only real technology that counts. Listen and match their volume to the room. When the night is hardest and the map holds, you feel it in the way a child turns once and does not wake. In the way an elder's cough rises and loses nerve. In the way your own feet find the pouch without hunt. Morning rewards the discipline by asking almost nothing. 3 chips, a breath, a pole turned by a quarter hand. A bowl that thinks. Beds release bodies as if from a promise kept. The door unlaces without frozen sulk. The day enters like a friend who knows where to stand. Warmth, which began at the hearth and under the tongue, continues in the soles of the feet as they meet the floor that remembers. The microclimate of a bed disappears back into the macroclimate of a house that has decided to be merciful again. A house that breathes must also learn to walk. Movement is not a break in the winter's agreement. It is part of it. When the valley's grammar changes, when the elk trail leans toward a different shoulder, when the creek's thin water speaks too loudly of hard ice below, when the wind writes from a new quarter for more than a handful of days, the circle lifts, folds, and go. Warmth, having been designed, is then packed. The lodge becomes a bundle of its own instructions. Striking the house begins with the invisible, a last reading of air and air. Coals are not bullied into drama. They are spread thin, let down with clean snow, smothered under a patience of damp earth. Children learn that a hearth does not end with a flourish, but with courtesy. The reddened stones that cracked in loyal service are carried a short way off and laid in a deliberate scatter, not as trash, but as a small honesty for whoever may kneel here, long from now, and wonder which side faced the wind. A palm presses the earth and feels the memory thinning. Exactly as intended, inside. Order makes speed. The lining comes first. Loops lifted, hem stones unsewn, and dropped into a small pouch with a soft clatter. A girl who can place the lining in the dark can take it down without hurry. She coils it on itself like a sleeping snake, panels stacked, so rehanging will begin at the right pole without thinking. The door's inner curtain is untied and folded. Its laces, wound into a palm-sized skein, are pushed into its mouth so the bundle carries its own teeth. Nothing dangles, Nothing flaps. Hung skin, you say, becomes carried skin. Poles speak a light creak as the crossed ears are lowered. A practiced team moves like a loom unweaving, one hand on the crown thaw, one on the leaning spar, one shading eyes toward the gust that always appears when a cone forgets its rigidity. The cover brain soft, smoke sturdy slips with a single practiced shrug. The lacing edge unwinds like a sentence lifted from its page. Seams show their honesty in reverse. Stitches that did not complain under load do not sulk now, where hair out answered sleet. Hair in folds to protect the grain. A niece runs her hand along the smoke flap corners, nodding at the way the reinforcements kept their promise. She knots their cords to themselves so they will not tangle in travel's taut. Bundles become biographies. The cover is folded into itself in long, even breaths. Panels meeting their neighbors as they did on the frame. The lining coil. The winter door folds into a neat, dense book. Poles are paired, the ones that prefer the flaps laid together. The shy, straight ones matched, so they will not scold each other with friction. Lashings go on at the balance points. Learned the first time someone made a load too clever and paid for it in a bruised shoulder. Rope rawhide or traded cord wraps with a rhythm that hums from hand to hand. Stones are the last to leave and the first to arrive. They are counted the way you count cousins. Out loud, fondly, with the memory of who did what in the night. Wrapped veterans keep their pouches. A cracked elder retires to doorweight duty with ceremony as simple as a smile. Children carry small ones in doubled hands, 2 pebbles making a dignified, heavy sound inside a tiny bag. The travois gets the long, dense hearts. Balance is checked with a hip. The drag line is tested against a shoulder until the pull feels like work. Not theft. The room dissolves into path. Mats roll and show the floor's faint, warmed print. Robes become packs that still smell like sleep. The pot is wiped, its rim caressed with a scrap of braid so grease does not shout on the road. It will be the first to speak at the next site. Parfleches slot into their known places. Pemmican under a lash where shade rides. Berries above where they will not wet each other into a sulk. Sinew and all stowed where the first hour's wind will not coax them into squeak. Leaving the bench is not a vanishing. It is a neat sentence ending. The snow skirt that once insulated is combed down, so it does not stand like a pretending wall for someone else's weather. Footpaths are stepped smooth, so Thaw will not hoard meltwater and boot print. The ash lens is leveled until it reads as ordinary dirt to a hurried eye, and as the right kind of memory to a careful one. If a token is left, it is not a charge, only a courtesy. A willow twist tucked into the grass at door's edge. A small woven knot that says, "This was a room. It was kind. Be kind here." Travel is a reconfiguration of warmth rather than an interruption. The firekeeper ties a pouch with 3 clean chips and a thin curl of willow. The makings of the next hearth's first breath so that the ember can begin with memory. Not invention. The pot rides where its mouth faces wind, so the day will air it without scolding. A wrapped stone, only one sits where a child can keep a heel against it. A small mercy that turns a long hour into an ordinary one. The door laces are kept near at hand in case weather decides to rehearse on the road. A short stop can become a short shelter with 2 poles, a cover's corner, and good manners from the wind. Site choosing begins before the old site is out of sight. Eyes walk the ahead terrain as if it were already a map of drafts. The south shoulder you wanted 2 days ago becomes the shoulder you will take. The cut bank that made a windbreak in the last storm is busy with its own eddies today, and therefore refused. A woman with a good cheek for pressure holds her face to the air like a seed catcher. She smiles when the valley's word matches the idea in her wrist. Bench, aspect, break, spacing the old quartet play again in their unshowy key. Arriving is rehearsal performed without speeches. The first action is not dropping bundles. It is setting the new circle by wind and slope. Someone lays a piece of willow to mark the door. Someone else sets the first 2 poles in a shallow X that reads like a promise. The ground is tested with 2 stamps of a heel. Does it drain? Will it cheat? Then the cover is lifted, and the lodge remembers its shape the way a hand remembers a song. Lacing runs quick and steady. The seam tucks into itself with the contentment of a lesson repeated until it is simply the way things are done. The lining goes up before bold fire does. Loops find their poles. Hem stones return to their traveling pockets and pull the river's edge true around the room. The girl who coiled the panels uncoils them in the order her hands remember. Her forearms talk to gravity. Her cheek talks to the air. The flaps are given a day angle by instinct and then confirmed by face. A small flame reads the draft's grammar. A pot at the edge breathes to approve. In less than an hour, the room is not simply built. It is in conversation again. Meals after moving taste like competence. Stew sits and thinks on the trivet stone that warms quickly because it learned its job yesterday. A ribbon of fat makes a shine that feels like an apology from travel to knees and backs. Children eat as if the soup were an errand, and then fall loudly asleep with their calves crossed as though still on the trail. The old man pretends to check a fletching he finished a week ago and instead watches the flap's small semaphores talk with the valet. He nods when they reach agreement. A single wrapped stone goes by his ankle with a soft thud of a friend taking its chair. The first night in a new place always brings one extra wakefulness. You listen to learn which muscles the wind uses here and how the creek talks under its ice. The ash veil is drawn thinner than usual politeness in a new room. The door seam is touched once more before sleep, as if shaking hands with a neighbor. Beds feel slightly untrue until the second turning. Then the old microclimates reassert themselves, a child's inevitable heel escaping, the elder's cough losing nerve, the dog's corner making its own weather out of a small leakage from a stone. In the morning, the proof is gentle. Coals willing, corridor behind the lining cool and civic, the pot ready to speak. A draft that threads itself without putting nettles in the cheekbones. No one needs a blaze. 3 chips suffice. The camp wakes where it is, not where it was. Paths will be written today. The snow skirt will be persuaded into righteousness. The door will meet mittens that learned its laces yesterday and remember them now. Warmth, which traveled folded on backs and runners, stands up and resumes its work as if it had never been interrupted, because it was not. You could call this portability. The people who live it call it Tuesday. A lodge that breathes and moves is a promise kept across mile. Small, steady, shared. The same law that tuned flap and lining tunes. The road and the next bench. Stones remember, air learns, hands listen, food thinks, beds reform their climates. The door takes its vow in a new seam. Winter remains winter. The house resumes being merciful. The circle, lifted and set, is the same circle. Its warmth belongs to everyone in it. In this place, today. Warmth is also law, not the kind that lives in carved signs or the kind that arrives on paper from people who have never slept here, but the kind that keeps breath young because it keeps behavior courteous. A lodge that runs on small fires and patient stones depends on more than physics. It depends on a culture of sharing that does not require speeches. In this camp, mine and yours do honest work with tools and pony, but heat stored in stones, brewed in broth, shaped by flaps, maintained by hands is held in common. That sentence is older than any legend. Heat belongs to everyone, or it will not stay. There is a quiet etiquette to how this is enforced. The first rule is placement. Elders and the sick take the steady radiance, not the glare. This is not charity. It is investment. Their softer breaths and easier mornings reduce the room's work by dusk. A wrapped stone circulates like a cup. If 3 lodges face a deep cold, the stones themselves travel by hood and mitten handed across drifts with a nod. No tally. The night remembers who sent them. By noon, they are back where they began. Warmer for having worked. If a traveler from the river's far bend arrives late, their bed is made near the good heat, and no one remarks on the extra chip the room will pay for that comfort. Hospitality here is thermal. Fairness has instruments. A boy who lingers too long by the hearth when others need the lane is called back by a finger tapping the ash stick, a sound that contains a syllabus. A young woman who unwraps her own stone too early and wastes its stored temper learns from the look, not a scold. That patience lengthens warmth. The next night, she moves the stone for an elder before opening her own. A man who opens the door into a gust. Instead of loosening laces downward, so the seam falls politely, is not shamed. His wrist is turned, his hand retaut, his pride banked like a coal with ash over it. Still hot, but useful now. Signals keep the orchestra in time. Not all communication uses words, because words wake children. A pinch of ash lifted and let fall like snow, says bank now. 2 fingers tapped near the cheekbone, says flap a quarter hand. A palm turned down over the ember field means no blaze. The most important gesture is a small circle drawn with a fingertip on a stone pouch. Share this orbit, even outside, in a long blow. 2 poles held briefly in a V at the smoke hole, then close, then opened again as weather taunt, narrow for squall, open when it passes. Teenagers learn this language with a pleasure that surprises them. They thought warmth was about flame. It turns out to be about attention. Dogs become devices without ceasing to be themselves. The one at the door sleeps with a tail in a seam of warmth and a nose in the seam of weather. A woof that is almost a cough means nothing. A single harsh sneeze means snow change. A small, questioning growl says someone is near before the ear hears it. The firekeeper does not leap. She sits up, checks the flaps with her wrist, listens to the draft, and only then reaches for the thong. A dog that is part of the instrument gets a stone near its corner at last tending, because vigilance burns calories too. There are seasons inside the night. Early evening is for stories and mending, and the pot's polite voice. Middle night is for listening and the small corrections. 2-chip, a cottonwood coin remembering. A flap angle tuned to pressure's rumor. The hour before dawn is for generosity, moving a stone to a child's foot, sliding the pot a breath closer, loosening a thong on the door that tightened in the cold's ambition. A camp that understands these inner seasons spends less fuel and argues less with weather. The ledger reads like a poem. Hinge, ash, stone, flap, door, breath, healing when it is needed, borrows the same grammar, not prescriptions first, but air in place. A cough moves inward. A bed shifts. Steam is added by a bowl near the patient, and cedar smoke given its respectful distance. Food changes key. Broth that thinks slowly. Fat that returns without bragging. Visitors shorten their sentences. Hands wash more. The flap hand becomes almost anticipatory, finding the braid that keeps the lower air fresh without scolding lung. If medicine is given, it is part of a system that has already done most of the work by making the room kind. Conflict is handled as if it were a smoke eddy noticed. Re-angle, not fan. On a hard week, a cousin returns with pride, prickly as hoarfrost, and small frictions follow. Boots left in the lane. Jokes that wake a baby. A door loosed too wide into a gust. No counsel is called. Instead, the room teaches someone moves the boots wordlessly. The joke teller receives a bowl first, so his mouth has a better task. The door's laces are put in his hand, and he is shown the trick with a courtesy that would embarrass scolding. By morning, he is part of the instrument again. Warmth forgive, and the lesson has traveled all night by practice rather than lecture. Trade brings other rhythms and other materials. A length of cloth arrives and is tested as inner curtain behind the door. A small iron hook finds a life as a pot hanger that spares wrists. A kettle from a fort behaves differently than a clay pot from a cousin's valley. It holds heat in a new voice. Bosses the draft if placed in the wrong syllable. The room adapts, keeps what behaved, returns or trades what crowds the orchestra. Nothing is adopted because it shines. Everything is adopted because it helps. Pride that costs fuel is too expensive. Children are apprenticed to warmth by games that are just thinly disguised training. 1. Called draft is played with feathers and cheek. A feather is held at knee height behind the lining, while a partner adjusts the flaps. The goal is to make the feather dance without letting it fly. Another, stone path, uses small pebbles laid in arcs. The children move them like planets, learning the timing that keeps a night kind. A third, door, times lacing and unlacing with mittens on. Speed is nothing without manners if the seam flaps. The point is lost. By spring, the games are over, but the muscles remember. Humor oils the gear. Winter is work, and laughter makes work agree to be done again tomorrow. A grandmother names a sulking chip after a notorious gossip, and everyone snorts when it smokes. The room relaxes. The chip redeems itself when paired with a better coal. Someone compares the draft on a tricky night to a shy horse, and talks to it under his breath while holding the poles. The night behaves, and the joke gets told as a weather report the next afternoon. A dog farts in its sleep, and blame travels the circle with mock solemnity until it reaches the dog, who thumps his tail and accepts the verdict. Morale is not separate from physics. It keeps hands gentle. Memory keeps accounts that instruments cannot. A woman can place the lining's hemstones in the same order, each move because her palms know their weight as a sequence. An old man can find the flint he prefers in a bag that has 3 nearly identical pieces, because the one he wants has a corner that presses his thumb like a promise. A girl wakes from a dream and reaches her foot to where the stone will be because some kindnesses are predictable delight. The room is full of these tacit maps, where tools live in dark, where a hand will pass when it tends, where steam should climb so it joins the draft and not the lungs. On nights without wind, music sometimes sits where the pot would sit, just at the hearth shoulder. A voice low enough not to wake the smallest ones. A drum that respects the flaps. A rattle so modest it could be mistaken for ash settling. Songs that belong to seasons are not sung out of season respect, is part of warmth. And songs for work are left for work. But a tune that keeps hands going through sinew. A melody that makes stitching find its run. A cadence that hints to the ember field that stories are nearly done. That music belongs here and behaves well. The lodge seems to smile when it hears it. A draft that already knew its path walks it with more confidence. Visitors from other architectures teach and are taught without affront. Someone from an earth lodge describes how deep ribs keep nights gentle and how a smoke hole behaves under snow weight. Listeners here translate those lessons into cone and lining. In return, the visitors borrow chipcraft and flap reading and carry those habits home without calling them by the same names. Later, when the valley's roots cross again, the talk is not about superiority. It is about how different houses asked the same questions and got useful answers. The lesson that sticks is the same one the air keeps repeating. Tune to place, tune to people, tune to season tone. The law that warmth writes grows a few appendices as winter ripens. Small, steady, shared acquires early. A flap corrected early prevents a cough later. A stone moved before a heel searches saves a wake. A door laced before weather arrives wastes fewer chips. Small, steady, share. Early is a mouthful and no one says it out loud, but you can watch it being practiced in the way a teenager stands before the blow and adjusts angles by the wrist while laughing at a joke he doesn't quite hear. He is on time. The room will thank him at dawn. By late season, the house and the people have taken each other's shape. The cone's creak announces weather hours before it steps through the door. The pot's simmer is a metronome for chores. The lining's hem knows the weight of each small stone by name. The door's seam can be read with fingertips, the way a hunter reads mud. If you stand outside and look at the lodges on their bench, smoke braids up without insulting its neighbors. Snow skirts sit at exactly the right humidity. Paths curve as if designed by water. Nothing brag. Everything works. And the secret, if there is one that can be said without turning into a certificate, is that warmth here is not a thing you make and then possess. It is a practice you join. It is a series of courtesies exchanged with the valley, with the night, with each other. A small fire, a tuned lining, flaps that listen, stones that remember, food that thinks, beds that become climates, doors that keep their vow, dogs that report, hands that signal, laughter that oils, fairness that makes all of it keep working. When weather insists on having an opinion, that, in the end, is the only empire this room recognizes. A circle where heat is a citizen, not a king, and every breath is a vote for keeping it so. Late winter is 2 faces on one coin. Mornings can still bite like iron. Afternoons loosen as if the valley has remembered a joke. Warmth in such weather is not something you simply keep. It is something you undress by degree. The lodge that held night like a cupped hand must learn to open its fingers without dropping what it protected. Thaw is treacherous because it flattered. It says you may forget the old disciplines. The ones who sleep well do not forget. They lighten without abandoning. The first sign comes not from the ridge, but from the pot. Steam smells different in late season rounder, less desperate. Lids can sit flatter because the room no longer needs every ounce of its moisture. The firekeeper, who has measured drought by lips and not by instruments, lifts the pot a thumb width away from the hearth and lets the simmer reduce to a murmur that does not boss the draft. Chips come less often, though never in handfuls. Stones need shorter lessons. Ash spreads thinner. You could call it economy. It feels more like courtesy. giving winter its clean goodbye instead of making it linger inside. Snow skirts change careers. For weeks, they were recruited into insulation and were padded into obedience with a stick. Now they threaten to become traps. In daytime, they soften and lean into the cover's hem. At dusk, they set like glass and seize the lower edge with teeth. So the combing ritual reverses. Lift, not pack. A girl who learned the storm dance now learns the thaw dance, tapping and loosening the skirt away from the hide, so evening will not make a hostage of it. You hear a new sound. Ice dropping away in tinkling sentences, poles answering with a relieved creak that is almost a laugh. Inside, the lining begins to rise. Not all at once, never that, but in a series of courtesy. First a finger on the south arc, then a finger on the west. Each lift is confirmed by cheek and by the smoke's braid. The corridor behind the ozan narrows because the cold river outside is running weaker now and needs less taming. You watch for sulk, a cough, a sulking chip, a smell that says the ember is being scolded by a wet afternoon. If any of that appears, the lining bows back down for a day. Patience has always been the room's grammar. Spring does not revoke it. Mats are pulled and sunned on a day when wind behaves. Their smell is a ledger, willow and smoke and fat, and a little of everyone's winter. Hides are eased from their places and shaken once downwind, away from the door, and their hair combed with fingers. So old ice and ash let go. The low thrum of a spring day lives in that work. A hum without tune, lungs opening because the air has put away its knife. Sinew seams, inspected for fretting from months of flex, are dabbed with a whisper of grease, and spoken to like animals that carried more than their share. Thank you, says a thumb pressed along a stick. The hide hears. Or you do. It amounts to the same. Fuel habits soften, too, without becoming careless. Chips still obey the hinge. A blaze is still a boast that wastes everyone's breath. But willow cut in winter begins to feel a little eagerness in the hand. Cottonwood coins are saved for night alone, not afternoon. A child is given a small, new job. Lay out tomorrow's chips on a piece of bark near the door, so they finish drying in the day's shy warmth. He learns by smell when they are right. No tang of thaw, only the prairie's ghost. This is curriculum hidden in chores. By summer, he will be able to choose fuel by sound. By fall, by sight in the distance, and by next winter, by wrist alone. Beds lighten first in the outer arc, then in the inner. A woven buffalo hair robe is swapped for a smoked hide. An infant's bundle breathes through an extra gap. The wrapped stone at the child's feet waits an hour longer before being sent. Pride returns in small ways. A teenager refuses the head wrap one night and finds no penalty. An elder loosens their robe by a hand's width and gives a look that contains both relief and defiance. The firekeeper notices, files the news under room's appetite reduced, and cuts one chip from the midnight ration without ceremony. The door teaches the new season to behave. In deep winter, it was a vow, laced until it breathed only through courtesy. In Thaw, you must guard against its becoming a gossip. Wind that has lost its ambition to crush lodges makes another kind of mischief, flirting into seams at odd hours, delivering damp questions to bedding, carrying smells that wake dogs and children needlessly. Loosen downward, always downward. Let the seam fall against itself, not gape. Tie back only as wide as a body needs to pass with hands full. Do not let the habit of ease steal the room's hard-earned manners. If someone forgets, the wrist is turned gently. Rituals keep the night from being rewritten by weather that thinks it is harmless. Health returns by increment. Coughs that have been part of the room's music fade like a story that has been told too many evenings in a row. Noses wake without needing steam to persuade them. Hands, which cracked and healed and cracked again, begin to become just hands. The pot changes its inventory. More greens from the south slope. The first onion with a bite that tastes like ambition. A scrap of meat stretched thinner because bodies ask for less ballast now. The broth becomes lighter without becoming silly. A small luxury appears, a pinch of something sweet that was saved for exactly the night when winter's back can be felt loosening under the day. It is given to the one who tended the flaps all season. No one says why. Everyone knows. The hearth is cleaned, not as if you were ashamed of winter, but as if you respected what it gave. The ash lens is drawn down to its memory. Char is saved for kindling if dry, return to earth if not. A shallow bowl that served as underhearth is reshaped with a hand and a wetted palm, smoothed as if to thank it, then left to harden in the new sun. Stones are rotated to see who cracked under duty. Retirements are given without sentimentality. A cracked veteran becomes a doorweight with a new life of keeping breezes from inventing themselves. No tool is mocked for aging. Every tool is told to rest where it can still contribute without breaking. Trade season begins in the mouth as much as on the trail. A cousin arrives with a packet of seed. Another with a length of cloth fine enough to behave as a door curtain for those days, when air is kind and privacy still matters. They bring news of rivers that have given up their ice reluctantly, and of benches where Thaw runs like a loose horse. In exchange, they learn the winter's ledger here, how the lining sat lower this year without sulking, how stones from the bend called Fox's Crossing were better behaved than last year's, how the pot liked to sit a thumb more to the lee on storm nights when the wind changed key. Wisdom is traded like beads, one lesson for another, none of it hoarded. Children return to outside as if exiled monarchs had been restored. The games that trained wrists and cheeks move to the open. Feathers that taught draft now teach wind proper. Pebbles that were planets become fish, dam, fort, a dozen other kinds of learning disguised as trouble. A stick that combs snow off the cover becomes a singer's staff. The song is terrible and perfect. Dogs, who carried the door's news with such discipline, frolic and are forgiven. The room's orchestra plays with windows open to the world. The conductor, the flaps, still listens, still corrects. But the music has a different meter now. Danger does not vanish with Thaw. It changes clothes. Chinook whines. If this valley knows them, arrive like messengers with warmth in their hands and tricks in their pockets. They soften hides too quickly if you let them. So covers are loosened, then retightened in the same afternoon. Seams are checked for complacency. Lacing thongs are oiled against drying into vanity. Damp creeps where cold once ruled. The cure is air and sun, administered early. Not a blaze that would invite the old mistakes to return in spring's costume. Mice think the same thoughts every year. The answer is the same. 2. Tidy. Elevate. Listen. One evening, on a day that was almost kind, and then remembered a grudge at dusk, the old man sets his palm to the floor at the hearth's edge and says the same sentence he said after the 5-day blow, but in a different key. It remembered. He means the ground, warmed and cooled 100 times, now holding a moderation that has nothing to do with bravado. He also means the people, who learn not to let a soft afternoon talk them into a hard night. The firekeeper answers by setting 2 chips in a hinge and pulling a veil of ash so thin it is almost air. It will be enough. It always was, when everything else kept its manners. Before the first true warm day, there is a ritual of looking backward that has nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with accuracy. The women spread the cover over poles in sun and walk its seam, reading winter's story in the faint polish where a palm pressed off it, the slight dark where smoke wrote its periodic signature. Repairs are made with sinew that still loves water and therefore tightens into loyalty. The men check poles for a shy crack hidden by habit, replace 2, shorten one that learned to complain. The lining's hemstone pouches are mended where a child's dreaming foot kicked truth into fabric. The ledger of warmth is closed for the season, not with a blessing, but with a checklist. And then, one morning, the door unlaces into a different year. Breath does not make a ghost. The creek talks in a register that sounds like decisions. Smoke braids because it is polite, not because it must. The pot thinks like a bird instead of like a shelter. The dog sneezes in pure frivolity. The room's law small, steady, shared. Early does not retire. It simply changes uniform. Warmth that winter demanded by disciplined spring now provides by grace. But grace is fragile unless tended. The flaps still listen. The lining still tutors. The stones still remember, though now they do so lightly. The door keeps its vow without needing to tighten it to a knife's width. The people, who are the true instrument, keep time to a different song and feel the same gratitude. If you were to boil the season's turn into a single action, it would be a hand at the lining, lifting it a finger, and then waiting to see if the room smile. If it does, the finger becomes 2. If it does not, the hem sits down again. That is the whole method, winter or spring. Ask, listen, adjust, share. Warmth belongs to everyone in the circle, or it will misbehave. The circle knows them, and because it knows, the thaw is not a loosening into chaos, but a careful unbuttoning. The way you undo a child's coat when the sun finally decides to be generous. The child grins, so does the valley, the lodge, which never learned how to gloat. Simply breathe. Summer returns like a long exhale, and with it, the knowledge that warmth does not end. It only changes address. In the bright months, heat moves outdoors and builds its arguments in the open. Sun on shoulder, stones too hot for bare feet. The slow, glittering anger of noon. The lodge loosens to a schoolhouse for shade. Flaps are not so much tuned as invited to make doorways for wind. The lining learns lightness, rising a hand and then two, until the corridor becomes a lace rather than a lane. What was once a winter machine becomes a listening pavilion. Yet the winter law still hums within it. Small, steady, shared. Early does not go on vacation. It simply swaps fur for grass and ember for breeze. Children chase drafts the way they chased feathers behind the lining. And their play is still apprenticeship in disguise. A girl holds a hand at shoulder height and calls out the valley's temperature in pretend numbers. An aunt grins and answers with a flap, opening the smoke hole to the cloud road, making a current that threads the cone without stirring dust. A boy lays pebbles in new orbits around a sun that is now a bowl of cool water. He is learning the same physics in reverse. How gentle cold can be invited and shared, the way gentle heat was. In the evening, a story remembers last winter and laughs at nothing. The laughter is a firewall against boasting. No one says it out loud, but everyone knows. The house's strength wasn't ever flame, it was attention. Work in summer writes the next winter's ledger. Hides are scraped in patient shade. Brains are warmed. Not to a boil, the skin behind the wrist still decides, and the smell that means ready is recognized by a girl who spent a season reading air at ankle height. Sinew is teased and pounded and spun, and knots are practiced so that a wind months from now cannot find where to pry. The ozan's hemstones are inspected like teeth. Pouches are mended where a child's dreaming foot proved itself again. Women, whose wrists taught the flaps their dialect, now teach sinew its grammar, and the room, though open to summer, keeps listening. Stones go back to the river to recruit cousins. The old man squats at the bar, called Fox's Crossing, and taps candidates with a thumbnail. Dignified thud. Yeah, tinny chatter. No. Bread-pocked skin. Not this year. Children fan out along the bank with two tasks. Collect good shapes and bring back tails of minnows that look like mirrors. The good shapes are tested with modest heat at camp proximity first, then a spit that should dance and vanish, never hammer. And then they are assigned careers. Wrapped stone, trivet, doorway, apprentice. The river approves by going on, unconcerned, and by giving up one oval that fits a grandson's palm as if it had been carved for it alone. The boy puts it in his bag. He has no words for loyalty yet, but he feels it. Fuel is scouted in ideas rather than in armload. Willow stands are read for next winter's sticks and for what the beaver will think of them. Cottonwoods along a bend are audited with respect. You may fall, we will be there if you do. Chips are gathered. Not in sacks, the herd season is another story now, but in stores, where to look when the snow is crusted and the drift hides treasure. How to listen for the hollow that means dry. How to smell for old sun, not last week's rain. A child repeats those teachings without realizing they are teachings. When winter returns, their wrist will already know half the answer. Travel stretches out under the long arc. Camps shift to a shoulder that holds water and night song. The lodge is struck and lifted as if in one breath. Cover folds into biography. Poles lay themselves into pairs that have learned not to quarrel. The lining coils like a bright snake. Door laces are wound and placed in the door's own mouth so that next time the vow will be easy to speak. When the new circle is set, no one pretends this is novelty. This is the same room walking, the same packed with air, the same bench work translated to a different page. The cone stands. The flaps listen. The pot thinks in daylight. Warmth is now shade. Shade is shared. Visitors come with their architectures and leave with yours, and nobody feels robbed. An Earth Lodge expert squints up into the cone and says, "Your smoke listens early." The flap keeper nods at that sentence and writes it down inside, where it will matter in January. In return, the visitor sketches a rib that keeps snow honest in deep storms. A teenager watches the drawing and understands that ribs can be ideas as well as timber. A woman from farther north shows a hood cut that makes sleet forget arrogance. In exchange, she learns hinge of chips, tries it by a summer fire, and laughs at how long a small flame can think when it is not scolded into boasting. Trade is rarely beads. It is habits that fit inside other habits. The year spills into work that looks like rest. Bows are unstrung and then retaught their patience. Arrow shafts are straightened by a knee that remembers where the winter stone sat at midnight. The awl's tip is refreshed on sandstone, the movement the same as the one that once traced the lining's hem to be sure the stone sat true. A kettle from a fort learns to behave by the same rules. The clay pot learn, do not bully the draft. Sit at the edge of thought, return what you were given slowly. Tools are inspected by touch, their edges are summer's coal. An infant sleeps with one foot escaping a robe because some truths do not belong to seasons at all. Evenings carry a new music that does not forget the old. A drum speaks from outside the door, respectful. A rattle answers with restraint. A voice finds a melody that will not offend tomorrow's wind. Laughter leans back in its chair. Someone tells the story of the 5-day blow again, and now it has a joke where the hard part used to sit. But the lesson remains. Flaps early, ash thin, stones with career, door with manner, heat in common. The children can recite the law like a rhyme now, but what matters is that their hands move in time. When the pot needs nudging, or when a gust announces itself on cheek, the old ones begin to say, a little more often, what they used to imply. Teach it while you are not cold. They mean knot and seam, and sight and cheek and ash. They mean the 3 chips set aside at dusk for the person who wakes first. Because generosity that is prepared is worth double. They mean the wrapped stone moved at the hour before dawn. A ritual now, a ceremony then, a kindness forever. They mean the habit of looking outward at weather and inward at breath before touching anything. A girl rolls her eyes the way girls do and then, later, moves a flap a quarter hand on a still night for no reason, but that her face asked for it. The braid improves. She smiles in the dark. She will remember that in January as if it were an invention. It will be a memory. When the first cold hints return, tiny scouts sent at dawn. A sound in the creek that lives lower on the scale. The lodge tightens its belt in places only hands can see. The lining is lowered a finger where it had been cheeky. The door thong is re-greased so the vow won't squeal at 20 below. Stones are brought from their summer work as Doctor waits to the hearth's edge and reintroduced to ember grammar with a sweetness that respects their long memory. Chips are set by the door in a parfleche that has never learned to gossip. Nobody calls this preparation. It is simply the year behaving as designed. Elder, who once sat nearest the slow radiance, begin to spend longer afternoons in that same corner. Not for heatnet, but for continuity. Their knees talk to stones by habit. Their eyes follow the flap's small semaphore without needing to stand. They use fewer words and teach more with a palm placed on a seam or a hem pressed here and not there. A child's ankle receives a stone on a summer nap out of pure mischief. The child grins because the kindness feels familiar, even when it is unnecessary. It is good practice to carry surplus tenderness into easy weather. What remains, as the circle closes on a whole year, is a plain truth in a handsome garment. A house that breathes is a community wearing a roof. Its parts cover, pole, lining, flap, door, hearth, stone, mat, bowl, game, dogs, jokes. Discipline are instruments tuned to place and to each other. Any piece alone is cleverness. Together they are mercy. Winter was the exam. Spring the recess. Summer the lesson plan for the next exam. Autumn the quiet sharpening of tools and reflexes. Through it all, the law stayed small enough to teach to a child and large enough to shelter a camp. Shape the air before you burn. Trade flame for stored heat. Answer the wind. Don't challenge it. Keep it small. Steady, shared, and early. So we leave the lodge where we found it, breathing. We leave the bench chosen with humility. The door laced with intention, the lining listening with its hem of little stone, the flaps that translate pressure into comfort, the hearth that prefers ember to theater, the stones that remember like elders who do not brag, the pot that thinks instead of shouts, the beds that are climates, the dogs that report, the hands that signal. the fairness that keeps the whole from fraying. Outside, the valley runs its own great system. Inside, a circle keeps faith with it by running a smaller, human one. If you've read this far with warm cheeks and unpunished lungs, then you have been sitting in the right kind of house. When the next hard night comes, and it will, you will know what to do with your hands before you know what to call it with your mouth. You will set 3 chips aside at dusk. You will lift and lower by fingers, not by fists. You will place 1 modest wrapped sunrise by someone else's heel before tending your own. You will lace the door downward, listen with your face, and let the room work as designed. And in the morning, when the seam loosens, the coals answer, and the pot lifts its first breath, you will write the only metric that ever mattered into the day with your body, woke without a cough.